Before our story begins, allow the day to grow quiet around you. Let your breathing soften and imagine the gentle scent of autumn apples, the hush of rain upon old windows, and an orchard resting beneath the evening sky. There is nothing you need to do now, and nowhere else you need to be. Simply close your eyes, settle comfortably, and let us journey together to Merecombe. In the first week of October 1893, the mornings in Bath began beneath a light grey rain. It settled upon the pale stone terraces, gathered along the edges of shop awnings, and left the streets shining long after the clouds had thinned. By 8 o'clock, delivery carts were already passing through the city, their wheels making a soft, regular sound upon the wet road, while shopkeepers lifted shutters and swept the dampness from their thresholds. For nearly 30 years, Agnes Bell had arrived at Bell & Son before the first customer. She entered through the side door, removed her gloves, and placed them in the same shallow drawer beneath the accounts desk. Her hat went upon the second peg, her umbrella in the brass stand, and the morning invoices were arranged according to the order in which she intended to examine them. Only after these things had been done would she walk through to the front of the shop and inspect the displays. The shop had belonged first to her father-in-law and then to her husband. In its earlier years, Bell & Son had sold tea, dried fruit, preserves, and whatever fresh produce could be obtained in reliable condition from farms beyond the city. Agnes had begun at the front counter shortly after her marriage, while the men of the family managed contracts, deliveries, and purchases. Gradually, she had learned the rest. She came to understand the difference between a good season and a fortunate week, between a supplier who spoke confidently and one who could be trusted, and between fruit that merely looked fine beneath the window glass and fruit that would still be sound when a customer carried it home. After her husband's death, Agnes had continued the business with Thomas, their only son. She had kept the accounts, dealt with suppliers, inspected deliveries, and maintained the standards by which Bell & Son had become known. Nothing bruised was placed at the front of a tray. No two labels were written in noticeably different hands. Apples were arranged according to color and size, with the largest at the center and the smallest removed before the display reached the shop floor. Customers rarely saw the work behind such order. They saw only polished fruit, clean glass, straight labels, and shelves upon which every jar appeared to have found its proper place. That morning, however, Agnes paused as soon as she entered the front shop. Her chair was no longer behind the counter. It had stood there for many years, a narrow oak chair with a worn crosspiece and a cushion Agnes had recovered twice in dark green cloth. She used it when checking invoices, answering letters, or resting between the morning deliveries and the afternoon customers. Now it had been moved to the wall beside the accounts room, where it stood beneath a framed notice concerning winter opening hours. In its former place was a low wooden stand holding 3 baskets of pears. The arrangement was sensible. The pears could be seen clearly from the doorway, and customers waiting at the counter would no longer have to pass around the legs of the chair. Agnes understood the improvement immediately. What she did not understand was why Thomas had made it without mentioning it. She touched the back of the chair as she passed, then turned her attention to the fruit. Thomas had altered other things during the previous afternoon. The preserves were no longer grouped entirely by jar size, but by their use at the breakfast table or in cooking. A small sign beside the apples distinguished those best eaten fresh from those suited to baking. The window display contained fewer items than Agnes would have chosen, yet each could be seen more clearly from the street. Nothing had been done carelessly. That was what made the changes difficult to dismiss. Thomas appeared from the storeroom, carrying a ledger beneath one arm. He told her that the early delivery had arrived without difficulty, and that he had already written to the pear supplier about 2 damaged crates. Agnes asked what reply he expected, and he explained the allowance he had requested. It was the same allowance she would have asked for herself. He then mentioned that he had moved the chair to give customers more room near the counter. Agnes looked once towards it. "Yes," she said. "I can see the reason." There was no argument. Thomas returned to the storeroom, and Agnes opened the ledger to examine the morning entries. The columns were neat. The totals were correct. Even the note concerning the damaged pears had been placed on the page where she would have looked for it. For some months, Thomas had been taking more of the daily work upon himself. At first, Agnes had considered it a natural relief. He was no longer the young man who waited for her approval before ordering 6 additional crates or changing a price by a halfpenny. He knew the regular customers, understood the suppliers, and could recognize which improvements would save labor without lowering quality. Still, she had not expected competence to alter the shape of the room around her. Shortly before 10 o'clock, a boy from the solicitor's office delivered a large cream envelope. Agnes carried it into the accounts room before opening it. She already knew the general contents, for several letters had passed between Bath and Somerset during the previous weeks, but this was the first to confirm that the transfer had been completed. Merecombe Orchard, together with its small house, cider building, storage rooms, equipment, and adjoining land, now belonged legally to Agnes Bell. The property had been left to her by Eleanor Vale, her cousin on her mother's side. Eleanor had been scarcely 2 years older than Agnes, and in their girlhood they had spent several autumns together at Merricombe. Agnes remembered baskets beneath the trees, wet grass against her boots, and the hollow sound of apples falling upon the roof of the cider house. Yet the memories belonged to a period so distant that they no longer seemed arranged as part of her own life. After Agnes married and settled in Bath, the 2 women had followed separate paths. Eleanor remained at Merecombe, unmarried and without children, while Agnes gave her years to Bell and Son and to raising Thomas. They had never quarrelled. Their distance had formed more quietly than that, through work, responsibility, and the repeated belief that another season would provide a better time to visit. Occasional letters had continued between them. Eleanor wrote about late frosts, strong harvests, repairs to the cider press, and varieties of apple whose names Agnes only half remembered. Agnes replied with news of Thomas, the shop, and the changes taking place in Bath. Neither woman wrote with complaint. Neither asked why the other had stayed away so long. Jonah maintained the orchard, and Clara attended to much of its daily business and bookkeeping, but neither possessed any claim upon the house or land. Eleanor had owned Merecombe outright, and her will named Agnes as its sole inheritor. The formal document offered no explanation for the choice. There were practical reasons enough. Agnes was Eleanor's nearest surviving relative, understood property and trade, and could be trusted to settle an estate without confusion. Yet she did not know why Eleanor had chosen to leave her the orchard rather than arrange its sale herself, or make some provision for the people who had worked there. That question remained unanswered in the solicitor's letter. A second document concerned Mr. Merton, a commercial grower who owned land beyond Merecombe. He had offered to purchase the entire property at a figure higher than the ordinary valuation, and had asked for an answer by the beginning of November. His terms were clear, the funds secure, and the proposed transfer uncomplicated. Agnes saw no immediate reason to refuse. She had no intention of becoming an orchard owner in Somerset. Her home was in Bath, and Bell and Son represented nearly 30 years of disciplined work. Merecombe was valuable land, but it was also distant land, requiring labor, repair, and supervision. A sale would remove those responsibilities and turn an unfamiliar inheritance into something that could be measured and properly used. Even so, Agnes would not sign away a property she had not inspected. Before accepting Mr. Merton's offer, she intended to examine the buildings, review the accounts, confirm the condition of the trees, and make certain that the price reflected the orchard's true worth. She expected the work to require several weeks at most. She would travel to Somerset, settle Eleanor's remaining affairs, approve the sale if the figures proved satisfactory, and return before the winter trade demanded her full attention. Thomas had already shown that he could manage Bell and Son in her absence. The ledger, open before her, gave no evidence to the contrary. Agnes folded the solicitor's letter and placed it beside the invoices. From the front shop came the muted sound of customers entering, followed by Thomas's voice as he greeted them. He did not call for her assistance. A crate was opened in the storeroom. Paper rustled around a purchase, and the till drawer closed with its familiar wooden click. The business continued with the same quiet steadiness, whether Agnes stood behind the counter or remained in the small room beyond it. At midday, she told Thomas she would leave for Somerset the following morning. He received the decision calmly. They discussed deliveries, payments due, and the orders that would need confirmation before the end of the month. Thomas made notes without asking whether she believed he could manage. Agnes gave instructions without saying that she already knew he could. Later, as the rain thinned against the windows, she returned to the front shop and found her old chair still standing beneath the notice. She considered moving it back behind the counter. There was enough room if the pear stand were shifted several inches to the left. Instead, she sat down where Thomas had placed it and watched him finish arranging a new delivery of apples. Most were round, red, and nearly equal in size. Thomas polished each one with a cloth before setting it upon the tray. At the bottom of the crate, he found a smaller apple, greenish-brown, slightly uneven, with a narrow scar along one side. Agnes expected him to put it aside. Thomas turned it once in his hand, wiped the dust from its skin, and placed it among the others. At 7:15 the following morning, Agnes left her house beneath a sky the color of unpolished silver. The rain that had passed over Bath during the night had thinned to a fine mist, scarcely visible except where it gathered upon the brim of her hat and darkened the shoulders of her traveling coat. Along the street, servants were whitening steps. Delivery boys carried covered baskets towards the shops, and the first carts of the morning moved carefully over the wet stone. Agnes had packed only what she required for several weeks: 2 practical dresses, a heavier woolen shawl, walking boots, night clothes, and a small number of personal articles arranged with sufficient care to prevent the need for a second case. In the leather bag she kept beside her were the solicitor's letter, Mr. Merton's offer, a notebook, 2 sharpened pencils, and the figures she had copied from the most recent valuation of Merecombe. She had also brought Eleanor's last 3 letters. Agnes had not intended to take them. They contained no information that could assist with a sale. One described a late frost that had damaged the early blossom. Another mentioned repairs to the roof of the cider house. The last, written several months before Eleanor's death, included a brief account of the Merricombe keeper trees and the hope that autumn would be dry enough for gathering. Nevertheless, when Agnes had closed her case that morning, she had found the letters still lying upon her bedroom table. After a moment, she placed them between the pages of her notebook. Thomas had again offered to accompany her to the station, but Agnes had refused. Bell and Son would receive 2 deliveries before 9, and she saw no reason for him to leave the shop merely to watch her enter a railway carriage. Their farewell had taken place beneath the awning, outside the side door, where drops of water still fell at regular intervals from the canvas edge. They spoke first of the business. Agnes reminded him of a payment due on Thursday, and an order that should not be increased unless the supplier reduced the transport charge. Thomas listened without impatience. When she had finished, he told her that he would write if any matter required her decision. For one brief moment, neither of them moved. Then Thomas lifted her case into the waiting cab, and Agnes told him she expected to return before the beginning of November. He closed the door after her and stepped back beneath the awning. As the cab moved away, she saw him turn towards Bell and Son before they had reached the end of the street. The station roof held the mist and coal smoke beneath its high glass panes. Steam moved slowly across the platform, covering the lower halves of passengers before lifting towards the ironwork overhead. Porters passed with trunks upon their trolleys. Doors opened and closed along the waiting carriages, and a whistle sounded somewhere beyond the grey veil. Agnes found a place beside the window in a compartment occupied by only 2 other passengers. She placed her case above the seat and kept the leather bag beside her. When the train began to move, she looked back once at the platform, though there was no one there whom she expected to see. For a time, Bath remained close around the railway. Pale terraces rose upon the hills, their windows dim beneath the morning sky. Chimneys, garden walls, church towers, and rows of wet roofs passed beyond the glass. Agnes recognized several streets from their upper windows, but had rarely considered what they looked like from the departing train. Gradually, the houses became fewer. Open ground appeared between clusters of buildings, and the city loosened into pasture, divided by dark hedges. The stone changed in color. Small roads curved away from the railway and disappeared behind stands of trees. Water remained in the furrows of harvested fields, reflecting brief pieces of the brightening sky whenever the train passed at the proper angle. Agnes opened Mr. Merton's offer and read it once more. The amount was substantial. It reflected not only the present orchard, but the commercial possibilities of the land. Mr. Merton proposed to remove several of the older trees straighten the irregular rows, introduce varieties that produced larger and more uniform fruit, and use the eastern ground more efficiently. His plan was clear, and clarity had always reassured Agnes. Land required labor, and labor ought to produce something that could be counted. She made a brief note concerning the condition of the storage buildings, then closed the document. There was little value in examining the offer again before she had seen the property for herself. Beyond the window, the Somerset fields stretched beneath the low October sky. The harvest had left them in muted shades of brown, dull gold, and deep green. Cattle stood close to the hedges, their backs darkened by rain. Bare patches had begun to appear in the branches, though many trees still carried leaves made heavy by the weather. Occasionally, the train passed an orchard, and Agnes saw small points of red and yellow remaining among the foliage. The sight brought back Merecombe in pieces. She remembered walking between the rows with Eleanor when they were girls, though she could no longer place the year. Their baskets had been too large for them and had struck against their skirts as they carried them. The grass was wet, and the lower branches released cold drops whenever a sleeve or shoulder disturbed them. She remembered the cider house more clearly than the main house. Apples had fallen upon its roof with brief, hollow knocks before rolling towards the gutter. Inside, the air had been cool and sharp with the scent of crushed fruit. There had been dark boards beneath their feet, a heavy press, and wooden vessels whose purpose Agnes had once understood because Eleanor understood it. Another memory came without its beginning or end. Eleanor tying a narrow strip of cloth around the handle of Agnes's basket so that the two would not confuse their fruit. Agnes could no longer recall the color of the cloth. She remembered only Eleanor's fingers drawing the knot tight and the loose ends moving whenever the basket was carried. None of these memories gave the orchard greater financial value. Agnes knew that. Memory could make an object seem precious to someone who no longer had use for it, just as habit could make an inefficient arrangement appear necessary. She had spent years at Bell & Son, separating usefulness from sentiment. Merecombe would require the same discipline. Yet as the train travelled farther from Bath, the property became a little less like a name in a solicitor's document. It acquired wet grass, cold hands, the sound of falling apples, and a strip of cloth whose colour had been lost. By late morning, the mist had lifted, though the sky remained overcast. Agnes ate the bread and cheese she had brought from home, taking care not to allow crumbs to fall upon her coat. One of the other passengers left at a larger town, and the second followed several stops later. For the final part of the journey, Agnes sat alone. She removed Eleanor's last letter from her notebook. The writing had become less firm towards the bottom of the page, but the sentences remained practical. Eleanor mentioned that Jonah believed 2 old trees would require careful attention before winter. Clara had completed the September accounts. The Merecombe keepers were smaller than usual, though their flavour appeared sound. There was no suggestion of illness, no request that Agnes visit, and no indication that Eleanor intended to leave her the orchard. Agnes returned the letter to its envelope. When the train reached the small Somerset station nearest Merricombe, only 3 passengers stepped down. The platform was narrow, its bricks dark from rain, and beyond the low station building, Agnes could see fields rising gently towards a line of trees. Jonah was waiting beside a compact cart. Agnes recognized him only after he removed his hat. Time had bent him somewhat at the shoulders and thinned his hair, but his movements remained deliberate and steady. He greeted her quietly, took her case, and placed it beneath the dark covering he had prepared against further rain. He did not speak of Eleanor immediately. Agnes was grateful for that. Once she was seated, Jonah guided the horse away from the station. The road passed between damp hedges and fields from which the crops had already been taken. Fallen leaves lay pressed into the wheel tracks, and water trembled in the shallow ruts whenever the cart rolled by. "The main picking has begun," Jonah told her after they had travelled some distance. "There are late sorts still upon the trees. They will remain another week if the weather allows it." Agnes asked how many baskets had already been gathered, how many workers were employed, and what proportion of the fruit was expected to reach market. Jonah gave her the approximate figures. Some varieties had produced well, while others were below their usual yield. The youngest trees carried the most regular fruit, but several of the older rows remained useful. When Agnes asked about sales, wages, storage losses, and transport costs, Jonah explained that Clara kept the accounts and could provide exact figures. Agnes opened her notebook and wrote Clara's name at the top of a clean page. She had expected her inspection to begin with the trees. It now appeared that a proper valuation would begin at a desk. As the road narrowed, Jonah pointed out the land belonging to Merecombe. Agnes followed the line of his hand, though the boundaries were not immediately obvious. The orchard lay partly beyond a rise in the ground, hidden by hedges and older trees. From a distance, it seemed larger than she had imagined from the documents. The cart turned at last between two stone gateposts. Agnes sat a little straighter. The orchard did not possess the immediate order she had expected. Some rows ran straight across the slope, while others curved with the shape of the land. Young trees stood beside older ones, whose trunks were dark with age and marked by pale lichen. Apples of differing sizes remained among the branches. Beneath them, the grass had been cut short in some places and allowed to grow longer in others. Ladders rested against several trees, and filled baskets stood beneath a covering near the path. Beyond the orchard was a small stone house, weathered but sound. Farther down the slope stood the cider building Agnes remembered, its boards darkened by rain, and one section of its roof newer than the rest. Near it were the storage sheds and a yard marked by the repeated passage of carts. Nothing appeared neglected, yet very little appeared uniform. Agnes looked towards the older trees. Their branches leaned at different angles, and several produced fruit, too small or irregular for the front trays at Bell and Son. She then considered the open ground, the buildings, the younger rows, and the road by which produce could be carried towards the station. She could see the practical possibilities clearly enough. There was productive soil, usable storage, established access, and sufficient acreage to justify Mr. Merton's interest. With more regular planting and carefully chosen varieties, the orchard might produce a larger quantity of fruit that could be sold without excessive sorting. What Agnes could not yet see was the value of the system already living there. The cart stopped before the stone house shortly after 3 o'clock. The rain had ceased, but the orchard still held the weather in its branches. Drops fell quietly from the leaves, and the damp grass shone wherever the pale afternoon light reached between the trees. Somewhere beyond the house, Apples were being placed into wooden baskets, each movement producing a soft knock, followed by the rustle of straw. Jonah carried Agnes's case to the door. Before he could knock, it opened, and a young woman stepped out beneath the shallow stone porch. Clara was perhaps 30, plainly dressed in a brown wool skirt and a light blouse with the sleeves fastened closely at the wrists. Her hair had been pinned back for work, though the damp air had loosened several strands near her temples. There was nothing hurried in her manner. She greeted Agnes, took her travelling bag, and explained that a fire had been lit in the bedroom and hot water placed upstairs. Agnes thanked her and entered. The passage was narrower than she remembered. Its flagstones had been worn smooth along the centre, and the air carried the mingled scents of beeswax, cold stone, and the faint apple sweetness that seemed to enter from the orchard even when the doors were closed. A dark wooden stair rose beside the wall. Opposite it stood a long table upon which the day's post had been arranged beneath a small brass weight.
The house was neither neglected nor prepared to disguise the absence of its owner. The floors had been swept, the lamps filled, and fresh coal placed beside the grates.
Yet nothing had been moved, merely to make the rooms more welcoming. Eleanor's umbrella remained in the stand. A pair of gardening gloves lay upon the passage shelf, their fingers stiffened by dried earth. Above them hung a woolen shawl Agnes recognized from one of Eleanor's infrequent visits to Bath many years before. She looked at these things without touching them. Clara led her first to the bedroom. The room faced west across the orchard, and from its window, Agnes could see the upper branches of several old apple trees bending beneath the weight of late fruit. Her case had been placed beside a narrow bed. A jug of hot water stood in the basin, and a fire burned quietly behind the iron bars of the grate. "We kept this room for visitors," Clara said. "Miss Vale's room is across the passage. Nothing has been removed from it." Agnes took off her gloves and placed them upon the dressing table. "I shall begin the inventory tomorrow." Clara inclined her head. She did not offer to open Eleanor's room or explain what it contained. Agnes was grateful for the restraint. There would be time enough for cupboards, papers, clothing, and all the smaller decisions by which a life was reduced to objects that must be kept, given away, or sold. After Clara had gone downstairs, Agnes removed her travelling coat and changed her boots. She washed the dust of the journey from her hands, smoothed her hair, and opened the notebook she had carried from Bath. At the top of a clean page, she wrote the date and then divided the remainder into headings: household contents, orchard equipment, stored produce, accounts and contracts, repairs required. The categories steadied her. A room might contain memories, but it also contained furniture, linen, utensils, and articles of measurable condition. Agnes had learned after her husband's death that grief did not prevent practical work. It merely moved beside it, often without announcing itself. She began with the room in which she stood. The bedstead was sound. The washstand bore no visible damage. The wardrobe opened cleanly, though one hinge required oil. There were 2 blankets, 3 sets of linen, a small chest of drawers, and a woven rug faded more strongly near the window than beneath the bed. She wrote each item down. When she finished, the room had not changed, but it had become easier to understand. Downstairs, Clara had laid a simple meal in the kitchen: bread, cold meat, cheese, and a pot of tea. Jonah had returned to the orchard, and through the window, Agnes could see him moving between the nearest rows with two other workers. He paused occasionally to examine a basket before it was carried towards the storage shed. Clara poured the tea and told Agnes that the evening meal could be taken in the dining room if she preferred. "The kitchen will do," Agnes replied. The room was warmer and less formal than the front of the house. Copper pans hung above the range, their surfaces dulled by use rather than neglect. A dresser occupied one wall, and its shelves held plain white crockery, jars of preserves, and several blue-rimmed bowls. Near the window stood a small writing table covered by neat piles of papers. Agnes noticed the table at once. "The current orchard accounts?" "Yes," Clara said. "The weekly figures are there. The completed books are kept in the small office beside the pantry." Agnes glanced towards the papers, but did not rise to inspect them. The train journey had left a heaviness behind her eyes, and figures examined while tired often had to be examined twice. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "after I have seen the buildings." Clara agreed. She appeared neither anxious to defend the orchard nor eager to persuade Agnes of its value. That too Agnes noticed. They ate with little conversation. Clara explained the hours at which breakfast and supper were usually prepared, and told her that Jonah began work before daylight during the harvest. Agnes asked how long Clara had kept the books. 7 years, Clara answered. "Miss Vale kept them herself before that. We continued her arrangement." Her words suggested that the work of Merecombe had not paused when Eleanor died. Fruit had ripened, workers had arrived, baskets had been counted, and carts had gone out along the station road. The orchard had observed the loss of its owner only by continuing to require the same tasks. After the meal, Agnes walked through the ground floor alone. The parlour looked towards the western rows. Its curtains were faded at the folds, and a thin layer of ash remained in the fireplace beneath a carefully placed screen. Books filled 2 shelves beside the window. Most concerned gardening, household management, or the cultivation and storage of fruit. A basket containing mending stood beside Eleanor's chair, with a length of dark thread still drawn through the eye of a needle and fastened safely into the cloth. In the dining room, the table had been cleared, except for a shallow bowl containing 4 apples. Agnes stopped beside it. 3 were well-shaped and even in colour. The 4th was smaller, green beneath a reddish-brown surface, with one side slightly flattened where it had grown against a branch. A narrow mark crossed its skin. It resembled the apple Thomas had placed upon the tray at Bell and Son. Agnes lifted it and turned it towards the window. The fruit was firm, but it would not have met the standard she had maintained at the shop. Its uneven shape would interrupt the display, and the mark, though healed, might cause a customer to choose another. She placed it apart from the other 3 near the edge of the bowl. On the writing desk beneath the window lay several papers associated with the harvest. Agnes sat down and examined them one by one. There were counts of baskets gathered from different rows, notes regarding the use of ladders, and a list of fruit awaiting transport. Clara's handwriting was small and regular. Jonah's additions appeared in darker pencil beside the names of particular trees. Near the bottom of the pile, Agnes found a folded sheet in Eleanor's hand. The ink had faded slightly, and the paper had been opened often enough to soften along the creases. It contained short instructions for the autumn work: repairs to one ladder, replacement of several basket handles, inspection of 2 old trees before the winter pruning, and a reminder concerning the eastern side of the orchard. The 7 eastern rows were to be kept apart from the general market picking. The eastern gate was to be opened on the appointed 2 days, as it had been in previous years. Clara would keep the record. Agnes read the final lines twice. No explanation was given. There was no estimate of the fruit involved, no market price, and no indication of who entered through the gate or why 7 productive rows had been reserved for them. It was unlike the other instructions, each of which concerned an identifiable task or expense. She carried the sheet into the kitchen. "What are the appointed days?" she asked. Clara looked at the note and answered that the first would be the following Thursday. The second would occur a week later, provided enough fruit remained upon the trees. "And the people who come through the gate? People from the village? To purchase apples?" Clara paused only briefly. "Some payment is made," she said, "but not always in money." Agnes looked again at Eleanor's note. An arrangement without fixed prices, involving 7 rows of marketable fruit, was precisely the sort of custom that could continue for years, because no one had thought to calculate its cost. "I shall want the complete record before Thursday." "It is in the office," Clara said. "I will have it ready." There was no resistance in her voice. Agnes folded the note along its existing lines and returned it to the desk. By then, the light outside had begun to fade. The orchard changed from separate trunks and branches into long, dark shapes beyond the glass. Workers carried the last filled baskets towards the sheds, and Jonah crossed the yard to close one of the doors. Soon afterwards, the sounds of the harvest ceased. Agnes went upstairs and opened the door to Eleanor's bedroom. The curtains had been drawn back, though the room was dim. A narrow bed stood against the far wall. Beside it were a reading lamp, a water glass, and a book with a folded handkerchief marking the final page Eleanor had reached. Dresses hung inside the wardrobe. On the dressing table rested a brush containing several fine grey hairs. Agnes remained at the threshold. These objects could also be placed into categories. The linen might be given away, the furniture valued, the papers examined, and the clothing distributed where it would be useful. Yet she found that she could not begin that work in the last light of the day. She closed the door gently. When she returned to her own room, she found a small plate upon the table beside the fire. Clara had brought up one of the apples from the dining room bowl. The uneven fruit Agnes had placed apart from the others. A knife and folded napkin lay beside it. Agnes removed her watch, opened her notebook, and prepared to review the observations she had made since arriving. The plate occupied the space near her right hand. After a moment, she moved it towards the far corner of the table so that it would not cover her papers. She did not eat the apple, but neither did she ask Clara to take it away. The following morning began with a thin whiteness over the lower orchard. Mist rested between the trunks and softened the farther rows until only their upper branches could be seen above it. During the night, several apples had fallen upon the wet grass. They lay beneath the trees in muted shades of green, russet, and red, each surrounded by a small scattering of leaves. Agnes woke before 7. The fire in her room had gone out, and the window glass was cold beneath her fingertips when she drew back the curtain. On the table beside the bed, Clara's apple remained upon its plate. Its uneven side had turned towards the window, and the narrow scar across its skin appeared darker in the morning light. Agnes, dressed in her oldest travelling skirt, chose a pair of boots suitable for wet ground and went downstairs with her notebook. Clara had already lit the kitchen range. Tea stood beneath a knitted cover, and bread had been placed beside a dish of butter. From the yard came the scrape of a wooden crate being moved across stone. The day at Merecombe had begun long before the house was fully light. Agnes asked when Jonah would be free to show her the property. "He is checking the gathered fruit first," Clara said, "but he expected you to begin after breakfast." Agnes then asked whether Mr. Merton had been informed of her arrival. "He wrote yesterday. He will come at 2 o'clock if that is convenient. That will be suitable." Clara placed a small pile of papers beside Agnes's cup. They contained the present number of workers, the estimated quantity already gathered, and a list of repairs made during the previous 12 months. Agnes read them while she ate. The figures were orderly, though they did not yet provide the complete view she required. Some expenses belonged only to the harvest, while others had been spread across the year. Several forms of payment had been entered as goods or labor rather than money. She marked those lines lightly in pencil. At 8 o'clock, Jonah appeared at the kitchen door, wearing a heavy coat, darkened at the shoulders by mist. Agnes followed him into the yard. They began with the storage sheds. One held empty baskets, stacked according to size, along with straw, wrapping paper, and several wooden crates awaiting repair. The second contained gathered fruit, placed in shallow trays to prevent bruising. Jonah explained that the varieties were kept apart until Clara had completed the counts and the fruit had been assigned to its destination. Agnes wrote down the dimensions of both buildings and examined the roofs, doors, and lower timbers. One hinge required replacement. Several boards near the rear wall showed signs of damp but remained sound. The sheds were not new, yet there was no evidence that necessary work had been ignored. They continued to the cider house. The building was smaller than Agnes remembered from childhood, though its walls remained thick and its interior cool. The press stood towards the rear, beneath a high beam. Barrels occupied one wall, while clean buckets and tools had been arranged upon hooks. A section of the roof had been repaired with newer slate. "When was that done?" Agnes asked. "Last winter," Jonah replied. "The old roof began to let water through above the press." She checked Clara's list. The cost had been entered there precisely. Beyond the cider house stood the cart shed and a narrow workshop. Nothing in either building was especially valuable when considered separately, but together they formed a working arrangement in which tools, fruit, carts, baskets, and labor could move without being carried unnecessarily far. Agnes noted that as well. They then walked towards the younger trees. These rows most closely resembled the kind of orchard she had expected. The trunks stood at regular distances. The ground beneath them was comparatively even, and much of the fruit possessed the color and shape preferred by city customers. Agnes examined several apples without removing them from the branches. "These would sell readily in Bath," she said. Jonah agreed. The older part of Merecombe was less orderly. Several trees leaned towards the light. Some stood farther apart than others, and their branches had been trained according to decisions made many years before. A few produced large fruit, but others carried apples of irregular size and subdued color. Agnes stopped beside one trunk, marked by age and lichen. How many of these older trees remain? Jonah gave her the number and explained that their usefulness differed. Some still yielded reliably. Some bore little fruit but helped provide particular flavors for cider. Others required observation before any decision could be made. Agnes did not question the final distinction. She wrote the numbers beneath separate headings and continued walking. Near the eastern edge of the orchard, they reached the 7 rows mentioned in Eleanor's note. A low stone wall separated part of the ground from the lane, and a wooden gate stood at its center. The gate was closed, though the grass before it showed signs of regular passage. The eastern rows contained both young and old trees. Much of the fruit remained upon them, despite the main picking already being underway elsewhere. Agnes looked along the branches. All 7 rows are withheld from the ordinary market harvest until the appointed days, Jonah said, and afterwards, what remains is gathered in the usual way. She considered the quantity of fruit still hanging there. It was not enough to determine the fate of the orchard, but neither was it so little that its use could be ignored. Jonah gave a small nod. He did not defend the custom or attempt to explain it before Agnes had seen the figures. She was beginning to understand that both he and Clara had learned to wait for questions rather than place answers in her path. By noon, Agnes had inspected the boundaries, the water supply, the principal buildings, and most of the productive rows. She returned to the house with damp boots and several pages of notes. The property was in better condition than she had expected. It did not suffer from abandonment or serious disrepair. Its weakness, if it possessed one, lay in the variety of purposes to which its land and fruit were given. A simpler system might produce more. That conclusion remained with her when Mr. Merton arrived shortly before 2. He came in a well-kept carriage drawn by a dark horse and was shown into the dining room. He was a broad, carefully dressed man in his middle 50s, with clean boots despite the wet roads and a manner that suggested he preferred business to proceed without unnecessary delay. He expressed his condolences regarding Eleanor, though he did not pretend to have known her closely. Agnes placed his written offer upon the table between them. "You have valued Merecombe above the figure given by the solicitor," she said. Mr. Merton agreed. The land joined his own holdings along the northern boundary, making it more useful to him than it might be to another purchaser. He would not need to establish a separate management arrangement, and produce from both properties could be transported together. His explanation was direct and commercially sound. He intended to retain the younger trees that were yielding well. Several of the older rows, however, would be removed gradually and replaced with varieties chosen for size, color, regular bearing, and reliable sale. The uneven rows would be straightened where the ground allowed it. Open spaces between aging trees could then be used more efficiently. "The orchard has good soil," he said, "but it is asked to do too many different things." Agnes thought of the separate baskets in the storage shed, the old trees kept for particular flavors, and the 7 eastern rows still carrying fruit. Mr. Merton continued, "With fewer varieties, picking could be organized more quickly. Sorting would require less labor, and a greater proportion of each harvest could be sent directly to merchants without first being divided into numerous grades and uses. Crates, transport and sales could all be handled through his existing business. "And the cider house?" Agnes asked. "It may remain useful for storage. The press is sound, but cider need not be the principal purpose of the property." The answer contained no carelessness. Mr. Merton did not intend to destroy a productive orchard merely to impose his preferences upon it. He intended to make the land more consistent, easier to manage, and more profitable according to methods he had already used elsewhere. Agnes asked about the workers. "Those required during the transition would remain," he explained. "After the new planting became established, labor would be arranged across both properties according to the season." He made no promises concerning particular individuals, but neither did he speak as though human labor could be removed from the calculation. They discussed the house, the buildings, the legal boundaries, and the date upon which possession might be transferred. Mr. Merton's offer included the equipment and the stored produce remaining at the completion of the sale. He was prepared to honor current contracts that Clara could identify in the books. The more Agnes questioned him, the clearer the offer became. If she accepted, Merecombe would pass into experienced hands. The sale would provide a fair return without requiring her to manage land from Bath or abandon the business to which she had given most of her life. Mr. Merton would assume the expense of replanting, repairs, wages, and uncertain seasons. Agnes would be free to return to Bell & Son before the winter trade began. It was the reasonable course. Mr. Merton appeared to recognize that she had reached this conclusion, for he did not press her. He merely reminded her that the offer would remain open until the beginning of November. "I prefer to decide from complete figures," Agnes said. "As do I," he replied. After he had gone, Agnes remained in the dining room. The afternoon light fell weakly across the table, touching the edges of the documents, but leaving the center of the room in shadow. From outside came the low voices of workers returning to the rows and the hollow sound of empty baskets being set upon the cart. Clara entered to collect the tea things. Agnes asked her to sit down. "Mr. Merton's proposal is fair," she said. "His plans would probably increase the quantity of marketable fruit and reduce several forms of labor." Clara did not dispute it. "However, the present accounts do not show me the orchard as a complete year. I have harvest expenses, weekly sales, repairs, and several entries whose value is not stated in money." "I can prepare a full calculation," Clara said. Agnes looked towards the window. Beyond the glass, Jonah was examining a basket before allowing it to be carried into the shed. One apple was removed and placed in a different container. From that distance, Agnes could not see what distinguished it from the others. "I want to know what Merecombe costs to operate for 1 year," she said. "I also want to know what it produces, not only what is sent to market, but what becomes of the remainder." Clara's expression changed slightly, though whether from relief or simple attention, Agnes could not tell. "That will take several days. You may take them. The harvest is still underway, and I shall observe it before I make my decision." Agnes closed Mr. Merton's offer and placed Eleanor's note about the eastern rows on top of it. "Show me the figures as the work proceeds," she said. "Not afterwards, when everything has already been given a name. Clara gathered the account papers into a neat pile. I will begin this evening. Outside, another basket was carried across the yard. Agnes listened until its sound had passed into the storage shed. For the present, Mr. Merton's unsigned offer remained upon Eleanor's table. The following morning, Agnes entered the sorting room shortly after the first cart had come in from the orchard. The room occupied the cooler side of the principal storage building, where thick stone walls kept the air still and faintly damp even after the sun had risen above the eastern rose. 2 long wooden tables stood beneath the windows. Empty trays were stacked against one wall, shallow baskets beneath the other, and across the boards lay the first apples gathered that day, their skins carrying the dull brightness of fruit newly brought in from cold air. Some were red and smooth, with scarcely any difference between one and the next. Others were smaller, green beneath their russet coloring, or marked where a branch had rested against them. A few had fallen before being picked and showed pale bruises beneath their skins. The mingled scent was sharper than the fragrance of the displays at Bell & Son. There, fruit entered the shop after it had been wiped, sorted, packed, transported, and arranged. Here, it still carried traces of wet leaves, soil, and the trees from which it had come. Clara stood at the farther table, with her sleeves turned back and an apron tied over her dress. Several baskets had already been placed around her, each bearing a small wooden label. Jonah brought in another load, set it beside the door, and returned to the orchard without interrupting their work. Agnes removed her coat and hung it from a peg. "I should like to see how the grades are decided," she said. Clara moved aside to give her room at the table. "These are from the lower western rows. They are nearly finished now." Agnes selected an apple and examined it beneath the window. It was firm, evenly colored, and without a visible mark. She placed it in the basket nearest her. The next was sound, but smaller. She turned it once, considered the amount a customer in Bath might pay for it, and placed it in a second basket. For several minutes, she worked according to the method that had guided her at Bell & Son. Fruit suitable for sale went to the right. Fruit that would not be acceptable upon the shop trays went to the left. The distinction was familiar and easily made. She knew which scars were only superficial and which suggested damage beneath the skin, which apples would endure transport, and which would begin to soften before they reached a city customer. Soon, the first basket contained fruit of regular shape and good color. The second held everything else. Clara watched until Agnes had nearly completed the tray. Then she drew 4 empty baskets closer. From Agnes's rejected pile, she took a small yellow apple and pressed it gently near the stalk. Finding it firm, she placed it beneath a label marked for the bakery. A larger fruit, with a dark line across one side, went into a basket intended for winter storage. An apple, bruised by a recent fall, was set in a shallow wooden tray to be carried to the cider house before noon. One with a fresh crack, though no sign of rot, was placed in a smaller container near the door. Agnes looked at the new divisions. "That one cannot be transported," she said, indicating the bruised fruit. "No," Clara replied. "It will be pressed today. And the cracked one, Mrs. Hale takes those for applesauce when the kitchen here has enough. They must be used quickly, but they are still sound beneath the broken skin. Clara selected another of the small yellow apples. The baker prefers these. They are firm and not too sweet. Their size matters less once they have been cut. Agnes picked up the apple and weighed it in her palm. At Bell and Son, it might have been offered cheaply in a mixed cooking basket, though more often such fruit was removed before reaching the front shop. A tray containing too many small apples made the whole delivery appear inferior, even when the flavor was good. She placed it in the bakery basket. They continued together. Clara did not correct each choice Agnes made, nor did she behave as though the categories at Merecombe were rules that could not be questioned. When a fruit seemed doubtful, she cut it open. Sometimes the flesh beneath an unpromising skin was white and firm. At other times, a nearly perfect exterior concealed a brown hollow near the core. Those apples went to the compost heap, for Merecombe did not preserve fruit merely because some part of it might still be recovered. That distinction reassured Agnes. The orchard was not avoiding waste by refusing to discard anything. It was determining more carefully when something had truly become waste. By mid-morning, the floor around the tables held 7 different containers. The finest fruit would be packed for market. Small, firm apples were reserved for 2 bakeries in nearby towns. Several older varieties would be laid in shallow trays within the cool store, where their flavor would improve and their thick skins would protect them into winter. Apples marked only upon the surface were separated for household use. Fresh windfalls were sent quickly to the press. Split fruit went to the kitchen or to local buyers who could use it that day. Only fruit already rotting was carried outside. Agnes followed one of the workers to the rear of the building and saw the compost enclosure beyond the wall. Spoiled fruit lay beneath layers of leaves, garden cuttings, and old straw. Even that final basket did not simply disappear. In time, Clara explained, the contents would be returned to the ground. The pulp from the cider press was used in a similar way, where suitable, mixed with other material, rather than left in a heap to sour. When Agnes returned to the sorting table, she looked again at the fruit awaiting classification. At Bell and Son, the purpose of sorting had been to decide what might appear before a customer. At Merecombe, the question continued after that decision. If an apple could not be placed upon a polished tray, it might still have a different destination, a different price, and a different period of usefulness. She thought of the word she had written several times in her notes the previous evening: waste. It had seemed precise when she wrote it. Now it seemed merely unfinished. Clara brought another shallow tray from the corner. The apples upon it were rough-skinned and somewhat flattened, their coloring divided between dull green and brownish red. Agnes recognized them as the same kind Clara had placed upon the plate in her bedroom. "They will not improve in appearance," Agnes said. "No," Clara replied, "but they keep well." She took one apple, cut it into 4 pieces, and removed the core. The knife passed through the flesh with a crisp sound. Clara placed 1/4 upon a clean saucer and offered it to Agnes. Agnes accepted it without comment. The skin was thicker than she preferred, and the first taste was sharper than that of the sweeter varieties displayed at Bell and Son. Yet the flavor did not vanish quickly. It deepened as she ate, becoming dry, fragrant, and faintly spiced, with an acidity that made the sweetness clearer rather than weaker. She looked at the remaining pieces upon the saucer. "What is the variety?" Merricombe keeper. Agnes knew the name from Eleanor's last letter, though she had not connected it with the uneven fruit. She took a second piece and examined the pale flesh before tasting it. It would not sell easily from an open tray. Not beside a bright red apple, Clara said. The answer held no criticism. It was simply true. Agnes considered how she might have offered such fruit in Bath. It would require explanation. Customers would need to be told that the apples kept well, that they were suited to winter storage, and that their appearance was no measure of their flavor. Such explanation took time, and time at a busy counter was itself a cost. Still, Bell & Son had built much of its reputation upon knowing the difference between goods that were poor and goods that were merely unfamiliar. She placed the remaining quarter back upon the saucer. The skin is coarse. Yes. The size is inconsistent. Yes. But the flavor is excellent. Clara wiped the knife upon a folded cloth. That is why Miss Vale kept them. Nothing more was said of Eleanor. The room returned to the quiet movement of hands, baskets, and fruit crossing the worn wooden tables. Outside, a ladder was carried between the rows. Now and then, an apple rolled against another with a small hollow sound, and from the cider house came the first slow movement of equipment being prepared for the afternoon pressing. Agnes resumed sorting. She did not abandon the standards she had used all her working life. The market fruit still required firmness, appearance, and sufficient uniformity to endure packing and transport. She rejected several apples that Clara also considered unfit. She found 2 hidden bruises before the younger worker beside her noticed them and separated one batch whose ripeness would have shortened the keeping time of the rest. Her experience remained useful, yet the 2 original baskets were no longer sufficient. By the end of the day, the market trays stood full against the inner wall. The bakery fruit had been weighed and entered in Clara's ledger. Apples for winter keeping had been carried into the thick-walled store. The fresh windfalls waited beside the cider house, and a covered dish of cracked fruit had gone to the kitchen. Only one small basket had been taken to the compost heap. Agnes returned to the house as the light faded across the orchard. Her shoulders ached faintly from standing, and the fingers of her right hand carried the scent of apple skin even after she washed them. Clara lit the lamp upon the kitchen table and went to check the figures entered during the day. Agnes opened her notebook. Beside the morning's estimate, she had written that nearly a third of the first load would be waste. She drew one careful line through the word. The figure itself did not change. Those apples were still unsuitable for the principal market, and Agnes would not pretend otherwise. Instead, she divided the amount beneath 3 new headings: for pressing, for kitchen use, for winter keeping. She rested the pencil upon the final line and read the page again. Her standards had not become lower. There were simply more of them now. 2 mornings later, the sky above Merecombe cleared for the first time since Agnes's arrival. The clouds lifted beyond the western fields, leaving a pale blue brightness that sharpened the edges of the orchard and drew long shadows from the trunks. Water still lay in the hollows of the lane, but the grass had begun to dry where the sun reached it. From the kitchen window, Agnes could see ladders moving slowly between the trees as the workers continued gathering the later varieties. She had spent the previous day reviewing Clara's figures from the sorting room. The quantities were modest when divided among their several uses, yet together they changed the appearance of the harvest. Fruit that would once have disappeared beneath a single heading in Agnes's calculations now remained present as cider, winter stock, bakery sales, kitchen produce, or compost returned to the soil. The figures did not prove that Merecombe should be kept. Mr. Merton's offer remained generous, and his plan would still simplify much of the orchard's work. Yet Agnes no longer wished to value a tree only by the number of flawless apples it could place inside a market crate. After breakfast, Jonah waited for her beside the yard gate. He carried no ladder or basket, only a pruning knife in its worn leather case. Agnes put on her coat, took her notebook, and followed him towards the older part of the orchard. They passed first through rows that had already been picked. The branches looked lighter without their fruit, revealing the structure beneath the leaves. Some trees had been carefully trained into balanced shapes, while others carried the evidence of storms, repairs, and decisions made many seasons earlier. A branch that had once grown east had been cut back. Another had been bound where the wood divided. Young shoots rose straight from certain limbs, their bark smooth beside the darkened surfaces below. Jonah stopped near the lower boundary. The tree before them was one of the oldest in the orchard. Its trunk leaned noticeably towards the south, and the lower side had thickened over many years to support the weight. The bark was divided by deep cracks, with pale lichen spreading across the shaded surface. One branch had been removed close to the trunk, leaving a rounded scar darkened at its center. Another extended low over the grass and required a wooden support beneath it. Only a small number of apples remained among the leaves. Agnes walked around the tree. From one side, it appeared less like a productive part of an orchard than something the orchard had simply learned to accommodate. The ground around its roots could have held a younger tree planted at a straighter angle. Its irregular branches also made the fruit more difficult to gather. "This is a Merricombe keeper?" she asked. Jonah nodded. Agnes looked upward again. "How much did it produce this year?" He gave her the approximate number of baskets. The amount was less than half the yield of several younger trees they had passed, and last year, somewhat more. The spring was kinder. He did not conceal the decline or surround the tree with sentimental language. He merely stated its yield, the effect of the weather, and the condition of two upper branches that would need pruning before another season. Agnes opened her notebook. If a young tree were planted here, how long before it produced an equal quantity? Jonah considered the question before answering. Several years would pass before a new tree bore reliably, though grafting could shorten the uncertainty surrounding the fruit itself. Then the old tree could be removed, and its strongest wood used for grafting. "It could," he said. There was no objection in his voice. Agnes had expected some reluctance. Jonah had worked at Merecombe long enough to remember the tree when its trunk had been straighter and its branches more heavily covered. Yet he did not speak of its age as though age alone entitled it to remain. Instead, he drew his knife and cut one of the smaller apples from a low branch. Its surface was rough and greenish-brown, with a dull red coloring on the side that had faced the sun. "The crop is small," he said, "and the fruit will never look finer than that." Agnes accepted the apple. Jonah explained that the tree's fruit kept longer than most of the brighter varieties. Properly stored, it remained firm well into winter, when softer apples had begun to wrinkle or decay. Its flavor also changed after several weeks in the store, losing some of its first sharpness while retaining the dryness that made it suitable for winter use. A younger keeper would do the same, Agnes said, if the graft took well. He pointed to several shoots growing from healthy wood above the main division of the trunk. Those could be used when new trees were prepared. The old tree therefore possessed value beyond the fruit currently hanging from it. Jonah then pressed the soil lightly with the heel of his boot and indicated the spread of the roots. The trunk was scarred, but the root system remained firm. The leaves had opened fully in spring, and the tree had produced sound blossom. There was no softness at the base, no hollow extending into the principal wood, and no sign that the roots had begun to fail. "It is old," he said. "It is not dead." They continued towards the northern side of the orchard, where two other trees stood beyond the last productive row. Even before Agnes reached them, the difference was clear. Neither carried fruit. One had failed to leaf properly in spring, and the few leaves that remained were brown at the edges. A section of bark had separated from the trunk, exposing dry wood beneath. The second tree stood almost bare. A principal limb had died back towards the center, and fungus had appeared near the base after the recent rain. "These are the two marked for removal?" Agnes asked. "Yes." "No grafting wood? Nothing I would trust." Jonah's answer came without hesitation. The trees would be cut during winter, and sound sections of the wood could be used where appropriate. The ground would then be examined before anything new was planted. Agnes stood between the two dead trees and looked back towards the keeper leaning south. All three were old. All three were irregular, yet treating them alike would not have been order. It would merely have been the removal of visible difference without regard for the condition beneath it. She made a note beside the figures she had copied earlier. 2 trees. Remove. Old Merecombe keeper. Retain pending calculation. Take grafting wood. The distinction was plain enough to fit upon 2 lines. When they returned to the leaning tree, Jonah cut the apple into sections with his knife. He removed the core and handed one piece to Agnes. She had tasted the same variety in the sorting room, but that fruit had come from a mixed tray. This piece had been taken directly from the old tree and was cooler from the morning air. Its skin resisted slightly before giving way beneath her teeth. The flesh was crisp, sharp at first, and then dry and fragrant. The flavor brought back something she could not immediately place. Agnes looked across the orchard while she ate the second bite. The memory did not belong to childhood at Merecombe. It contained lamplight, reflected in a shop window, brown paper folded around purchases, and the faint green scent of pine branches fastened above a door. One of the first Christmas seasons after her marriage returned to her in fragments. Bell and Son had been smaller then. Thomas had been an infant, sleeping in a basket in the room behind the shop, and Agnes had spent much of each day moving between him and the counter. On cold afternoons, customers had come asking for apples that would keep through Christmas and beyond. She remembered opening wooden crates whose contents were plain in color but strongly scented. Her husband had known the variety and explained its use to customers while Agnes tied string around their parcels. She could not recall where those apples had come from, the memory was too incomplete to offer an answer. It left only the shop, the winter light, and a flavor she had not realized she remembered. Agnes finished the piece and folded the seeds inside her handkerchief before noticing what she had done. She looked at them for a moment, then placed the folded cloth in her pocket. "How many Merecombe keeper trees remain?" she asked. Jonah gave her the number. Some were old, several were middle-aged, and a smaller group had been grafted more recently. Together they represented only a limited part of the orchard's acreage, and their total yield? Clara will have it in the yearly books. Agnes closed her notebook. Until then, the older trees had appeared in the accounts mainly through their lower output. Their other uses were scattered elsewhere: winter storage, cider, and grafting stock. No single entry showed what the variety contributed when all those purposes were considered together. She returned to the house shortly before midday and found Clara working at the kitchen table. Several account books lay open around her, and loose sheets had been arranged beneath small wooden weights to prevent the draught from disturbing them. Agnes removed her gloves. "In the one-year calculation, I want the Merecombe keepers entered separately." Clara looked up. "The fruit sold for winter storage," Agnes continued. "The portion used for cider, the losses, the keeping time, and the value of any grafting wood taken from the older trees. Do not combine them with the general crop. That will require the older yield books," Clara said. "Then we shall use them." Clara rose and went to the small office beside the pantry. Agnes heard a cupboard open, followed by the quiet movement of volumes being lifted from a shelf. When Clara returned, she carried 3 narrow ledgers whose covers had faded to different shades of brown. She placed them upon the table. Agnes drew the first book towards her. Dust remained along the upper edge, though the binding was sound. When she opened it, Eleanor's handwriting appeared beside dates from many autumns before. Outside, the old keeper leaned south beneath the clear October light. For the first time, Agnes did not ask how much ground it occupied. She asked what its fruit had become. The first pressing of the harvest began the following morning. Before the kitchen clock had struck 8, the yard was already filled with the muted sounds of preparation. Buckets set upon stone, wooden trays drawn from the storage shed, and the slow turning of a cart as it was guided towards the cider house. The air remained cool, though sunlight had begun to reach the upper orchard, touching the wet branches, while the lower grass stayed in shadow. Agnes finished her tea and carried her notebook outside. Several shallow baskets stood beside the cider house door. They contained fruit that had never been intended for the market trays. Some apples were small or poorly colored. Others had fallen during the recent rain and bore bruises where they had struck the ground. A few were split along one side, while several appeared almost perfect until they were turned and a darkened patch became visible beneath the stalk. Agnes stopped beside the baskets and examined them. At Bell and Son, wind-fallen fruit had rarely entered the shop. Even when the skin remained unbroken, a fall could bruise the flesh and shorten the time in which the apple might be sold. Transport from Merecombe to Bath would make the risk greater. By the time such fruit reached the counter, much of it would already have lost its firmness. Here, however, the distance between tree and press was no more than a few minutes. Jonah lifted one apple from the nearest basket and cut through the bruised side. Beneath the darkened surface, the damage extended only a short way into the flesh. He removed that portion and placed the sound remainder in a clean container. Another apple proved soft around the core and was rejected entirely. A third had split when it fell, but remained white and firm inside. It joined the fruit, awaiting washing. The work required judgment rather than indulgence. Merecombe did not press rot merely to increase the quantity in its barrels. Every apple was opened or examined closely enough to determine whether the damage could be removed. What remained had to be sound, even if it was no longer suitable for keeping or transport. Agnes set down her notebook and helped with the inspection. The scent of cut apples soon filled the yard. It was brighter and sharper than the sweetness inside the storage rooms. Juice gathered upon the knife blades, and pale pieces of damaged flesh accumulated in a small pail beside the table. The usable fruit passed into the washing tubs, where leaves, grass, and traces of soil were removed before the apples were carried inside. When the first baskets had been prepared, Agnes followed Jonah into the cider house. Morning light entered through two high windows and fell across the press in narrow bands. The thick walls held the night's cold, and the air smelled of old timber, clean water, and the faint remains of many autumn pressings absorbed into the wooden boards. Buckets stood ready beneath the outlet, while the first measured quantities of fruit had been arranged near the mill. They were not all of one kind. Bright, sweet apples occupied two baskets. Sharper cooking fruit filled another. Beside them stood a smaller tray containing rough-skinned apples of a dull greenish brown. Agnes recognized the Merecombe keepers. Jonah explained that no single variety produced the cider used at Merecombe. The sweeter apples supplied much of the juice, but could become flat when pressed alone. Sharper fruit gave freshness. A smaller amount of the more astringent varieties added dryness and allowed the flavor to remain after the first sweetness had passed. The keeper formed only a modest part of the mixture. Agnes watched as the fruit was measured. For every several baskets of sweeter apples, only part of one basket of keepers was included. Their contribution appeared almost too small to justify the older trees when considered by yield alone. The first apples entered the mill. The quiet morning sounds gave way to the steady crushing of fruit, the movement repeating without haste as the separate varieties lost their visible differences. Red skin, green skin, small fruit, marked fruit, and apples too uneven for any polished display were reduced together into pale, fragrant pulp. The pulp was wrapped and arranged within the press. Pressure was applied gradually. At first, only a thin line of juice appeared. Then it gathered more steadily, running into the waiting vessel with a soft, continuous sound. Agnes stood beside it and watched the level rise. The juice was clouded and light brown, unlike the clear cider that would later be drawn from the barrels. Its scent carried sweetness, acidity, and something drier beneath both. Jonah filled a small cup from the first flow and offered it to her. Agnes tasted it. The sweetness arrived first, but it did not remain alone. A sharper flavor followed. Then the dry, faintly spiced quality she remembered from the keeper beside the leaning tree. Though the variety formed only a small proportion of the pressing, she could identify its presence. She asked Jonah whether the difference would remain after fermentation. He told her that it would change, as all the flavors changed, but a batch made without the keepers lacked the same depth. Eleanor had tested the proportions over several harvests. Clara's records showed which mixtures had been used and how each batch had sold. Agnes looked towards the small tray of rough-skinned fruit. A calculation based solely upon those trees' yield would show fewer baskets, irregular apples, and slower picking. It would not show what happened after their fruit entered the press. Yet, if the keepers improved the finished cider, their value belonged partly to every barrel in which they were used. She returned to the doorway and opened her notebook. For each batch, Clara had prepared a separate sheet. The date appeared at the top, followed by the quantity of fruit, the rows from which it had come, and the approximate proportion of each variety. Windfalls were entered apart from picked apples, so that the amount recovered from fruit unsuitable for storage could be calculated. Apples removed because of decay were weighed and deducted. Agnes copied the arrangement carefully. The second pressing contained a slightly different mixture. Its sweeter fruit came from younger western trees, while the sharper apples had been gathered from 2 older rows near the house. Again, the keepers represented the smallest share. Again, their presence could be detected in the juice. Nothing in the process was accidental. The orchard's variety, which had appeared inefficient when Agnes first looked across the irregular rows, allowed Jonah to adjust the mixture according to what each part of the harvest supplied. One tree did not need to perform every task. Its fruit might be poor for a market tray and still improve something made with the fruit of 5 other trees. By midday, the pressed pulp had become pale and compact. It was removed in heavy slabs and broken apart before being carried outside. The emptied material was not left upon the floor or thrown into a refuse pit. It was taken towards the same enclosed area Agnes had seen behind the sorting room, where it would be combined with leaves, straw, and other suitable matter before returning gradually to the soil. The apples entered the cider house as fruit that could no longer be transported or kept. Their juice passed into vessels for fermentation. Their remaining pulp left by another door to become part of the orchard again. Agnes remained through the afternoon pressing. Her clothes took on the scent of apple juice and damp timber. Fine drops marked the cuffs of her oldest blouse, and her right hand became sticky where she had steadied one of the measuring vessels. She did not mind. Each stage answered a question that could not have been resolved from Eleanor's letters or the solicitor's valuation. Near 4 o'clock, Clara brought the first additions to the yearly calculation. They returned together to the kitchen, where the account books remained open upon the table. Clara placed several completed sheets beside Agnes's notebook. The first showed the amount received from cider sales during the previous year. The second gave an estimated value for fallen fruit recovered during the pressing season, apples that would otherwise have produced no income at all. Another sheet concerned the cider house itself. If the press were removed from Merecombe's system, windfalls and freshly bruised fruit would need to be sold at a very low price, transported quickly elsewhere, or discarded. Sending them to another press would introduce cartage costs and delay. Fruit that could be carried across the yard, while still sound, might soften before reaching a more distant buyer. The old building, therefore, had a value beyond the price of its timber, roof, and machinery. Its position within the orchard allowed time-sensitive fruit to be used before it became worthless. Clara then added the winter income from the long-keeping apples. Those sales continued after the principal harvest had ended, when many softer varieties were no longer available. The Merecombe keepers appeared repeatedly in those entries. Their appearance limited their value during the bright abundance of autumn, but their firmness made them more useful after Christmas. Last came the revenue from the regional bakeries. The figures were not large individually, yet they were regular. Small, sharp apples that city merchants might reject were purchased for pies, puddings, and preserves. Their value came not from being made to resemble dessert fruit, but from being sold to people who wanted precisely the qualities they possessed. Agnes read each sheet twice. The orchard's income remained less simple than Mr. Merton's proposed arrangement. It depended upon several buyers, several uses, and careful sorting. Labor was required to preserve distinctions that a more uniform orchard might remove. Agnes did not forget those costs, nor did she abandon the possibility of selling Merecombe. She merely revised the manner in which she judged it. Until then, she had examined the yield of each tree as though that number could stand alone. A tree producing half as many baskets appeared to possess half the value. Yet the cider house showed the weakness of that assumption. A low-yielding tree might contribute the flavor by which a larger quantity of common fruit became a more valuable finished product. Agnes turned to a clean page and wrote a new heading, Value after Combination. Beneath it, she entered the keepers used in the day's pressing, the number of barrels expected, and the previous season's selling price. The calculation was still incomplete. She would need to compare batches, losses, storage time, labor, and demand before drawing any conclusion. Outside, the final pressed pulp was being carried from the cider house. The yard had grown quiet, and the low autumn sun shone across the empty baskets, waiting to be washed. Agnes rested her pencil beside Clara's figures. The old keeper, leaning south, had not produced a great many apples, but its small harvest did not end at the tree. The principal harvest ended on Wednesday afternoon. By dusk, the ladders had been carried into the long shed, the last market baskets had been counted, and most of the trees across the western and central parts of Merecombe stood with their branches lightened. Only the late-keeping varieties remained in any quantity, along with the fruit reserved upon the 7 eastern rows. The following day was clear and cool. A low October sun entered Agnes's bedroom before breakfast and rested upon the small apple that still stood at the far corner of her table. Its skin had lost none of its dull green color, and the narrow scar remained visible where the light crossed it. Agnes dressed, checked her watch, and went downstairs with Clara's latest harvest figures beneath her arm. She spent the morning in Eleanor's office, comparing the quantity of fruit gathered with the uses entered beside it. The market crop had been packed. The bakery apples had been weighed. Several trays of Merecombe keepers had gone into winter storage, while the first cider vessels had been marked with their dates and mixtures. Clara's calculations were becoming more complete, though the orchard's many small transactions still resisted a single, simple total. Shortly after 1 o'clock, Agnes heard the sound of a wooden bar being lifted outside. She looked through the office window. Jonah was walking towards the eastern boundary. He carried a ring of keys and a small wooden notice beneath one arm. When he reached the gate in the stone wall, he unlocked it, pushed it back against the hedge, and fastened the notice to the post. Then he examined the ground just inside the entrance, moved an empty basket away from the path, and returned towards the orchard without closing the gate behind him. Agnes watched until he disappeared between the rows. She knew that this was one of the appointed afternoons mentioned in Eleanor's note. Clara had told her the date, and the records had been promised. Yet no one had explained precisely how the custom began, who was permitted to enter, or how the fruit was distributed. For nearly half an hour, nothing happened. Then two women appeared upon the lane, each carrying a covered basket. A boy walked beside them with a smaller container hooked over his arm. They stopped briefly at the notice, passed through the gate, and entered the first of the eastern rows. Agnes rose from Eleanor's desk. Before she reached the yard, another family had arrived. An elderly man came alone with a shallow basket, followed a few minutes later by a woman leading two children. None of them went to the house. No one waited to speak with Jonah or Clara. They simply entered through the open gate and began selecting apples from the trees. From a distance, it appeared that people from the village were helping themselves to the crop. Agnes crossed the yard and followed the path towards the eastern rows. She did not hurry, and she called to no one. The fruit had been deliberately left upon those trees, and the gate had plainly been opened for this purpose. Nevertheless, the absence of supervision disturbed her. Merecombe was still part of Eleanor's estate, and until Agnes decided otherwise, its produce remained an asset whose use ought to be understood. She stopped near the first row and observed. The people within the orchard did not behave as customers. There were no scales, prices, or written orders, yet neither did they move with the carelessness of people taking advantage of an unattended gate. One woman chose small, firm apples from the lower branches and placed them gently beneath a cloth in her basket. She rejected the largest fruit and examined the sharper cooking varieties instead. Nearby, the elderly man gathered windfalls from the grass. He turned each one beneath the light, keeping only those whose skins remained unbroken. A child climbed no tree and pulled at no branch. He waited while his mother twisted an apple from its stem, then carried it to their basket with both hands. Farther along the row, two older women worked together. One held the basket, while the other selected fruit within reach. When the container had become too heavy, the boy Agnes had first seen lifted it by both handles and carried it towards the gate for them. No one filled the cart. No one shook the branches to bring down more fruit. Each person appeared to understand an amount that had never been marked upon the notice. Jonah moved quietly among the farther trees, but he did not count the apples or inspect the baskets. His attention remained upon the orchard itself. He steadied one low branch, while an elderly woman reached beneath it, warned a child away from soft ground near the wall, and pointed out a tree whose apples were better suited to baking. He asked no names and entered nothing in a ledger. Agnes remained beside the path. Several villagers noticed her. They greeted her with the same restrained courtesy they might have offered upon meeting her outside the church or the village shop. No one attempted to conceal a basket or explain why they had come. Their calmness suggested that the right to enter had existed long enough to require neither defense nor apology. Clara approached from behind, carrying 2 empty hampers. The opening was announced on Sunday, she said. A notice was also placed at the shop. Agnes had not attended the church service, and she had not visited the village since the notice appeared. The entire parish might have known the gate would open, while she, the legal heir to Merecombe, remained unaware of it. How many people are expected? There is no list. Then how do you prevent the same family from taking more than its share? Clara looked along the rows. They do not. It was not an answer Agnes would have accepted at Bell and Son. Goods placed before the public required prices, quantities, and someone responsible for receiving payment. Trust might exist between regular customers, but it did not replace a system. Yet the fruit before her was not being emptied carelessly from the trees. One family left with a basket that was only 3/4 full. Another woman gathered no more than she could carry beneath one arm. The children who had arrived first were now helping the elderly man lift his windfalls into a cloth bag because the handle of his basket had loosened. Agnes asked how long the gate would remain open. "Until the light begins to fail," Clara replied. "It will open again next Thursday if enough fruit remains." "And those are the only 2 occasions?" "Yes, 2 afternoons after the principal harvest." Clara explained that only the 7 eastern rows were used. Fruit elsewhere in the orchard remained part of the ordinary picking, storage, and sales. When the 2nd afternoon ended, whatever remained upon the eastern trees would be gathered and assigned in the usual way. "The 7 rows have never been entered as part of the commercial yield," she said. Agnes turned towards her. "Never. Not in Miss Vale's books. That omission mattered. If the fruit had not been included in the expected market crop, its absence could not be described as a failure to meet the harvest estimate. Yet the apples still possessed value. Land, pruning, maintenance, and labor had all been required to produce them. Removing 7 rows from the commercial calculation did not remove their cost. Agnes watched a young girl choose 3 small apples and place them in the pocket of an older woman's apron. The child then returned to the tree, but only to retrieve the woman's basket. "Who is permitted to come?" Agnes asked. "Anyone who needs the fruit." "And who decides whether they need it?" "No one." Clara's answer was quiet. There had once been attempts, she explained, to send baskets directly to particular homes. Eleanor had found that some people accepted readily, while others refused because receiving a private delivery made their circumstances visible. Opening the gate required no explanation. A person might come for cooking apples, winter fruit, windfalls for sauce, or simply because a larger household could make use of what Merecombe had set aside. No distinction was recorded. "No one has to prove that they are poor," Clara said. Miss Vale believed that if no question were asked, no one would have to speak of what they wished to keep private. Agnes looked again at the villagers among the trees. At Bell and Son, she had known which customers required cheaper fruit. She had recognized those who counted every coin before ordering and those who waited until the end of the week to purchase what remained. Yet every exchange had still occurred across a counter. A price had preserved the form of an ordinary transaction. Even when Agnes quietly added an extra apple to a parcel or selected fruit that would last longer than the customer expected. Here, The open gate performed a similar service by another method. The people who entered did not stand before Eleanor to request help. They chose what they could use, carried it away, and left without naming the reason. Agnes understood the discretion of the arrangement before she accepted its economics. Is this custom mentioned in the title documents? No. In the conditions of the will? No. Then it is not an obligation attached to the property. Clara agreed. Agnes turned towards the northern boundary, beyond which Mr. Merton's land lay out of sight. If he purchased Merecombe, the 7 rows would become his to manage with the remainder of the orchard. He could retain the gate, change the arrangement, or close it permanently. Neither Eleanor's intentions nor the villagers' familiarity could legally require him to continue. Mr. Merton would be entirely within his rights to end it, Agnes said. Yes. Clara neither protested nor attempted to convert the custom into a promise Eleanor had failed to put into writing. The answer remained as plain as the legal position itself. By mid-afternoon, more people had entered, though the orchard never became crowded. Some stayed only a few minutes. Others moved slowly between the trees, comparing fruit according to the uses they understood best. One man selected small apples for baking and left the brighter fruit untouched. A woman knelt in the grass to gather sound windfalls that would not survive transport, but could be cooked that evening. Children carried baskets for those whose hands were stiff or whose steps were uncertain upon the uneven ground. The 7 rows were not stripped bare. When the first families left, branches still held more fruit than Agnes had expected. Nothing in their behavior resembled the uncontrolled loss she had imagined upon seeing strangers pass through the gate. The custom depended upon restraint, but that restraint had been practiced so often that no one appeared to think it remarkable. As the afternoon cooled, Jonah walked through the rows once more. He collected damaged fruit that had been left beneath 2 trees and placed it in a small cart for the cider house. Then he waited beside the gate while the last villagers made their way towards the lane. A child carried one end of an elderly woman's basket, while another child held the opposite handle. Between them, the weight was manageable. They passed through the opening slowly, their boots dark with wet grass. Jonah closed the gate after them and returned the wooden bar to its place. Agnes did not ask him to lock it permanently. Nor did she tell Clara that the 7 rows would remain if Merecombe passed into another season under her ownership. The afternoon had shown her how the arrangement worked, but observation was not yet a decision. The fruit given through the eastern gate still belonged somewhere within the calculation she had requested. On their way back to the house, Agnes asked whether Eleanor had kept any record of what left Merecombe on the appointed days. Not by household, Clara said, but the quantities were estimated after each opening. And the other things given from the orchard? There are records. Agnes stopped beside the yard gate. Behind them, the eastern rows had grown still again. A few pale apples remained visible among the darkening leaves. I want all of them, she said. Not only the eastern fruit. Include every basket of apples, every quantity of cider, every bundle of pruning wood, and anything else that left Merecombe without producing revenue. Clara inclined her head. I can bring the books after supper. Do so. I want to know the total value. Agnes continued towards the house, without looking back at the eastern gate. She had made no promise to preserve it, but before deciding whether it should close, she intended to discover what had passed through it. After supper, Clara brought the records into Eleanor's office. The October evening had closed early around Merecombe. Beyond the window, the orchard had disappeared into a darkness broken only by the faint square of light from the cider house, where Jonah was completing the last work of the day. The eastern gate could no longer be seen, though Agnes still remembered the measured procession of villagers passing through it with their baskets, each taking what could be used and leaving without being asked to explain why it was needed. Clara carried 3 account books beneath one arm and a narrower volume in her hand. She placed the ordinary ledgers upon the corner of the desk, then set the smaller book directly before Agnes. Its cover was brown cloth, faded, almost grey near the spine. No title appeared upon the outside. The corners had softened through use, and a narrow strip of ribbon marked a place near the middle. Agnes opened it. The first pages contained dates from more than 20 years earlier. Eleanor's handwriting was smaller than it had been in the later orchard records, though the form of each entry was already precise. A year appeared at the top of the page, followed by the name of the season and a heading written in dark ink, "Issued from Merecombe." Beneath it stood a list of things that had left the property without passing through the ordinary sales accounts. 2 baskets of apples had been given to the village carpenter. A quantity of cooking apples had gone to a woman whose name Agnes recognized from one of the cottages near the church. Several trays of small fruit had been sent to the school. Winter cider had been collected by a carrier who regularly traveled between the village and the station. Bundles of wood, cut during the pruning season, had been taken to another household. The entries were not confined to the eastern gate. They continued through winter and spring, recording fruit, cider, cut wood, and other useful portions of the orchard that Eleanor had allowed to leave Merecombe. No price had been written beside any of them. Agnes turned the page. The next year had been arranged in the same way. 2 baskets here, a bundle there. Cooking fruit, sent before a cold week. Cider, carried away in winter. Pruning wood collected after the trees were cut back in February. Some names appeared only once. Others returned across several seasons. The quantities remained modest, yet the years gathered them into something larger than the afternoon Agnes had observed. She drew a sheet of paper towards her and began noting the amounts. "Were these quantities deducted from the harvest totals?" she asked. "The fruit was weighed or estimated before it left," Clara replied, "but it was not entered among the sales." "Then it appears only here?" "In most seasons, yes." Agnes continued through the pages. Eleanor had not written explanations beside the names. There was no indication that one family had received apples because of illness, another because work had been scarce, or a third because there were too many children to feed comfortably through the winter. The ledger preserved the quantity and destination while leaving the reason unrecorded. It was the same discretion Agnes had seen at the eastern gate. Nothing required the recipient to become the subject of a story. Yet discretion did not eliminate value. Every basket represented fruit that might have been sold. Every bottle or small cask of cider contained apples that had been gathered, sorted, pressed, and stored. Even the pruning wood could have been retained for Merecombe's own fires or sold elsewhere in the village. Agnes reached the end of another season and added the figures in the margin of her paper. She did not call the book a ledger of debts. Eleanor had asked no person to sign beneath an entry, and there were no dates upon which payment became due. Nothing suggested that those who received from Merecombe had accepted a formal obligation to repay it. That did not prevent Agnes from seeing how much had been given away. The quantities increase in the poorer harvest years, she said. Clara looked at the page Agnes had opened. Sometimes they did. That is precisely when the fruit would have been worth more. Yes, Agnes put down her pencil. She had expected a record of the eastern rows, an estimate of how many baskets had passed through the gate on each appointed afternoon. Instead, she had found a much wider practice, extending through nearly every part of the orchard's working year. Eleanor had not merely allowed villagers to gather fruit after the principal harvest. She had continued issuing goods from Merecombe whenever she believed they could be used. Agnes looked towards the ordinary account books resting at the edge of the desk. Those volumes recorded market payments, bakery orders, cider sales, cartage, wages, repairs, tools, and every other expense Clara had been able to identify. If the items listed in the smaller book had been sold, their value would have appeared as revenue. If they had remained at Merecombe, some might have reduced the household's own expenses. Instead, they had left without payment. Calculate the total value that was not collected, Agnes said. Use the market rate where the fruit could have been sold at market, the bakery rate for the smaller apples, and the ordinary winter price for cider. The wood may be estimated according to what a household would otherwise have paid for it. Clara did not reach for the loose sheets. Instead, she drew the narrow volume gently back towards herself and turned several pages at once. Agnes watched her. Near the end of the same season, Eleanor had written a second heading, Return to Merecombe. The entries beneath it contained no money. The carpenter who had received 2 baskets of apples had repaired the door of the cider house. He had replaced one damaged board, reset the lower hinge, and charged nothing for his labor. The carrier who received cider during winter had taken Merecombe's casks to the station on several occasions without adding cartage to the account. The woman who had collected cooking apples had stayed at the house when Eleanor suffered a fever. She had prepared meals, kept the fire burning, and remained through 2 nights until Eleanor's strength began to return. The teacher and several pupils from the village school had come after a period of strong wind and helped gather sound fruit from the grass before bruising and rain could spoil it. A man whose family had received pruning wood had later repaired part of the gardener's cottage roof. An elderly villager had spent 2 days binding and grafting branches split during a storm. The entries continued. Some described work that could have been priced easily. A door repaired by a carpenter had an ordinary cost. A journey to the station had a known cartage rate. Roof work required timber, tools, and labor. Other entries resisted such exactness. Eleanor's care during a fever had not been arranged as employment. The school children had gathered windfalls slowly, sometimes carrying only a few apples at a time. The old man who repaired the damaged branches had used a skill acquired across many seasons, but no invoice had followed his work. Agnes read the first page twice. Were these returns agreed upon when the goods were issued? No, Clara said. The carpenter was not told that the apples required a repaired door? No. And the carrier did not receive cider in place of payment? Not in any formal sense. Clara explained that Eleanor kept the 2 parts of the record separately because she did not wish one to appear as the price of the other. A family might receive fruit one year and offer help much later. Some people returned more in labor than they had taken in goods. Others could do very little beyond carrying a message or watching the house for an afternoon. No balance was brought forward, and no name was marked as settled. Nothing in the book resembled the customer accounts Agnes maintained in Bath. At Bell and Son, an amount supplied on credit stood against a purchaser until payment was received. A transaction remained incomplete while the figures differed. Eleanor's book contained no such demand for equality. The carpenter had not repaired the cider house door because 2 baskets of apples were the exact price of his labor. He had repaired it because the door required attention, and Merecombe had once provided something his household could use. The carrier did not calculate how many journeys equaled the cider he had received. He simply omitted charges when he was able to do so. Agnes turned back to the beginning of the season and placed one finger beside the first name. Then she compared it with the same name beneath the later heading. The 2 baskets possessed a market value. The repaired door possessed another. Neither sum had entered Merecombe's accounts as revenue, but the repair had prevented money from leaving. She opened the ordinary expense ledger for that year. There was no payment to a carpenter during the month in which Eleanor recorded the work. The following year contained the cost of timber for another building, but no charge for the cider house door. Agnes checked the carrier's name next. Several deliveries to the station appeared in Clara's shipping records. Some included ordinary cartage fees. The journeys mentioned in Eleanor's smaller book did not. The absence of an expense was more difficult to notice than the presence of a payment. It occupied no line in the principal ledger and therefore looked like nothing at all. Yet the work had been performed. The cider had reached the station. The casks had continued to buyers. Merecombe had benefited even though no money had changed hands. Agnes returned to the page concerning the teacher and the children. The wind had brought down a considerable quantity of fruit that year. The harvest ledger showed an unusual amount sent to the cider house within 2 days. Until then, Agnes had assumed Jonah and the orchard workers had recovered it during their ordinary labor. Eleanor's smaller book revealed the missing hands. Without the additional help, much of the fallen fruit might have remained upon wet grass until it became too soft, even for pressing. The children had not produced revenue directly. They had preserved part of a crop that would otherwise have been lost. Agnes drew another sheet of paper towards her. She made 2 columns. In the first, she entered the estimated value of everything issued from Merecombe. Apples were divided according to their likely use. Cooking fruit could not be valued as dessert fruit, nor could windfalls be assigned the price of apples fit for winter storage. The cider received its usual local rate. The pruning wood was entered at the amount it might reasonably have brought if sold. In the second column, she began listing the work returned. The carpenter's repair could be compared with the cost of similar work elsewhere in the accounts. The carrier's journeys could be valued according to his ordinary charge. The gardener's cottage roof required an estimate based upon other repairs made in later years. The recovered windfalls could be measured through the cider produced from them, with deductions for the labor that would otherwise have been required. The care given during Eleanor's fever caused Agnes to pause. There was no suitable entry elsewhere in the accounts. A household nurse might have charged by the day, But the woman named in the book had not come as a nurse. She had been a neighbor carrying out necessary work because Eleanor could not do it herself. Agnes did not attempt to measure the kindness of sitting beside a sick woman through the night. She measured only the practical expense Merecombe had avoided: meals prepared, fires maintained, and temporary assistance that might otherwise have been hired. The distinction mattered to her. The new calculation was not intended to assign a price to every human action. It was meant to reveal economic consequences that the ordinary ledgers had concealed. Clara sat across from her and began collecting the corresponding records from the larger books. Neither woman spoke for some time. The clock upon the mantel marked the quarter hours. Once, footsteps crossed the yard as Jonah left the cider house, followed by the soft closing of a distant door. The room settled again around the movement of pages and the quiet scratch of pencils. Season after season, the same pattern emerged. Goods left Merricombe without producing direct revenue. Later, work entered Merecombe without creating a direct expense. The relationship was not exact. In 1 year, the value of the fruit and cider issued appeared greater than the labor returned. In another, a major repair performed without charge outweighed several seasons of small gifts. Some names occurred beneath both headings, while others appeared only once in the entire book. No person had been required to return what was received. Yet across the orchard as a whole, the practice formed a system. It helped move cider to the station. It maintained doors and roofs. It brought hands into the orchard after difficult weather. It preserved grafting wood that might have been lost after a storm. It kept Eleanor's household functioning when illness prevented her from attending to it herself. Those services would otherwise have required wages, transport fees, repair bills, or the acceptance of greater losses. Agnes leaned back and looked at the narrow volume between them. When she had first opened it, she had seen a list of uncollected payments. Eleanor appeared to have reduced Merecombe's income by distributing goods with no financial return. The later pages did not transform every gift into a profitable transaction, nor did they prove that Eleanor's method was the most efficient possible arrangement. The orchard still bore the cost of producing what it gave away, and goodwill could not be depended upon with the certainty of a signed contract. But the figures could no longer be treated as simple losses. The book recorded another kind of exchange, one that remained informal without being economically meaningless. It relied upon memory, restraint, and the willingness of people to help when they possessed something useful to offer. That made it less predictable than a commercial agreement, though not less real. Agnes opened Clara's developing plan for the coming year. Several projected expenses appeared beneath the heading for maintenance. Transport occupied another section. Seasonal labor had been calculated according to the number of workers likely to be required during blossom, pruning, and harvest. Enter these exchanges in the new plan, Agnes said. Clara looked up from the older ledger. All of them? As many as can be supported by the records. Agnes turned the narrow book so that both headings could be seen. The goods issued must be given an estimated value. So must the work returned. Keep them separate from sales and wages. I do not want either column made to look like cash, Clara considered the arrangement before nodding. We could place them beneath the ordinary accounts as non-monetary value, with an explanation of how each estimate was reached. Yes, and do not assume the same assistance will occur next year merely because it occurred before. The plan must still allow for necessary work to be paid for if no one offers it. Clara made a note. Agnes then pointed to the entries concerning transport and repairs. But where such work has regularly reduced Merecombe's costs, it must not be omitted from the record. Mr. Merton's figures treat the orchard as though every useful act must either be performed by an employee or purchased from outside. That has not been true here. She turned several more pages, following the names as they appeared beneath one heading and then the other. No single person held the whole orchard together. The carpenter understood doors, the carrier understood the road to the station, the teacher could bring willing hands after a wind, and the old man knew how to bind damaged wood before a split reached the trunk. Merecombe gave them apples, cider, or fuel because those were the things the orchard possessed. In return, the village sometimes gave Merecombe time, labor, transport, care, and knowledge, because those were the things its people could provide. Not every kindness returned by the same path through which it had left. The balance existed across years rather than beside each individual name. Clara gathered the loose sheets into order. Shall I still calculate the total value not collected? Yes, Agnes replied, but place beside it the expenses that Merecombe did not have to pay. She closed the ordinary ledger and left Eleanor's book open. The Eastern Rose had produced no market revenue that afternoon, judged only through the sales account. The fruit taken through the gate had vanished from the orchard without return. Yet the small volume before her showed that what left Merecombe did not always disappear. Sometimes it returned as a repaired door, sometimes as a journey to the station, sometimes as hands gathering apples from wet grass before they spoiled. Agnes had asked for the ledger because she wished to discover how much Eleanor's generosity had cost the orchard. By the time the clock struck 10, she had begun calculating how much of the orchard's work that generosity had quietly sustained. The book had not merely altered what Agnes felt about Merecombe, it had altered the arithmetic. 2 mornings after Agnes had finished reading Eleanor's ledger, she and Clara began the inventory of the storehouse. The list was required for the papers accompanying Mr. Merton's offer. Every building at Merecombe had already been described by size and condition, but the movable property remained to be counted. Ladders, baskets, sorting tables, cider barrels, pruning tools, empty boxes, lengths of unused wire, and several pieces of equipment whose purpose Agnes did not yet understand. Whether these things would be included in the sale or valued separately had not been decided. Agnes intended that nothing should pass into another person's possession merely because no one had taken the trouble to record it. The morning was dry but cold. A pale light entered through the small windows beneath the roof, catching the dust disturbed whenever Clara moved a basket or Agnes opened a cupboard. The storehouse smelled of old timber, sacking, and the faint sweetness left behind by many seasons of fruit. Along one wall stood rows of shallow trays. Most were empty now, although several still held late apples, separated by strips of straw. Clara carried the ledger, while Agnes examined each part of the room. 6 long ladders, Agnes said. Clara wrote the number beside the description. 4 short, 3 sorting tables. 11 sound picking baskets. There are 2 more behind the press covers. Agnes waited while Clara brought them forward. One had a broken handle, and the other had split along its base. She entered them separately, rather than adding them to the sound baskets. They worked without haste. Clara knew where most things belonged, while Agnes noticed which objects had not been used recently and which repairs had been postponed. A stack of boards rested near the back door. Old barrel hoops hung from nails. Beneath a folded tarpaulin lay several wooden apple measures, darkened by years of handling. Agnes asked what each object was used for, and Clara answered when she knew. When she did not, they left a blank beside it for Jonah to identify later. At the far end of the storehouse, a tall wooden rack stood against the stone wall. It held lengths of rope, empty sacks, and several shallow boxes, too worn for market use. One leg had sunk lower than the others, causing the rack to lean slightly towards the wall. "That must be moved before we can see what is behind it," Agnes said. Clara removed the lighter objects from the upper shelves. Together they drew the rack forward, stopping twice when one of its feet caught between the uneven stones of the floor. As it moved away from the wall, a small cloud of dust rose from beneath it. The shortened leg had not been repaired. Someone had leveled it by resting it upon an overturned wooden crate. Clara bent and pulled the crate free. The rack settled heavily to one side, but Agnes steadied it until Clara placed a block of wood beneath the leg. They then turned their attention to the box. It was smaller than the orchard crates stacked near the entrance and more strongly made. One slat had loosened, and the corners were worn smooth where ropes had once passed around them. Dust covered the base, together with fragments of straw and 2 curled leaves that had found their way beneath the rack. Clara turned it upright. Faded black letters appeared upon one side. Much of the paint had disappeared into the grain, but the words could still be read. Bell and Son. Bath Agnes stood without speaking. The familiar name looked strange upon the rough wood. She had seen it printed above the shop front, pressed into sealing wax, written at the head of invoices, and painted in neat black letters upon delivery boxes. For more than 30 years, it had belonged to polished counters, balanced accounts, and the daily movement of goods through the Bath premises. She had never expected to find it beneath a leaning rack at Merecombe. Clara brushed the remaining dust away with the edge of a cloth. "Was this one of your boxes? It belonged to the shop." Agnes touched the faded lettering. The shape of the ampersand was the old one used before Thomas had persuaded her to order a cleaner design for the newer crates. Even the spacing of the words was familiar. She remembered seeing the same mark upon boxes stacked in the rear passage during the early years of her marriage. "What would it be doing here?" Clara asked. Agnes did not answer at once. Bell and Son had purchased fruit from many growers over the years, but she could not remember Merecombe among them. The orchard's name had not appeared in the supplier's books she had managed after taking responsibility for the accounts. Nor had Eleanor ever spoken to her about sending apples to Bath. "Were any old delivery records kept here?" Agnes asked. "There are several books from before Aunt Eleanor began using the present ledger. They are in the office cupboard." They left the rack standing away from the wall and carried the crate into the house. In Eleanor's office, Clara opened the lower cupboard beside the desk and removed a row of narrow books bound in faded cloth. Some contained wages and repair costs. Others recorded harvest quantities, buyers and deliveries. Their labels had darkened, and several could be read only when held near the window. Agnes placed the Bell and Son crate beneath the light, while Clara arranged the books by year. They began with the period shortly before Agnes's marriage. The pages held the names of cider makers, market traders, shops, and private households. Certain buyers returned every season, while others appeared only once. Bell and Son was not among the earliest entries. Clara opened the next book. Near the middle of the volume, Agnes saw the shop's name. The first delivery had consisted of 8 crates of Merecombe keepers sent to Bath after the main autumn crop had been gathered. A second entry recorded 12 crates the following year. More followed, 10, 14, then 17. Besides several deliveries, Eleanor had noted that empty Bell and Son boxes had been received at Merecombe and were to be returned after packing. Agnes drew the book closer. The dates belonged to the first years of her marriage. At that time, her father-in-law still controlled most purchasing, and her husband had dealt with the growers and carriers who supplied the shop. Agnes had spent much of each day at the front counter, serving customers, arranging displays and keeping the smaller household accounts. After Thomas was born, her mornings had often been divided between the rooms above the shop and the business below. She remembered winter apples arriving in dark wooden boxes. She remembered checking their condition, wiping those marked by straw, and setting the soundest fruit in shallow trays. Yet the names of the orchards had remained in the purchasing books kept by the 2 men. She had known the fruit through the shop, not through the land from which it came. Clara turned another page. The Merecombe deliveries continued for several seasons. Some consignments were sent in October, and others held until November. Notes beside the later entries described the fruit as sound, firm, and suitable for keeping. One line instructed that the apples be stored apart from softer varieties intended for immediate sale. Then the quantities began to fall. 17 crates became 11, 11 became 7. In the following season, only 4 were sent. Eleanor had written that the keeper rows had produced poorly after a cold spring. The next year was no better. A final entry recorded 3 crates delivered to Bell and Son and several empty boxes returned to Merecombe for a crop that proved too small to fill them. After that, the shop's name disappeared. Agnes searched the remaining pages, but the arrangement had ended. Bell and Son had required a dependable winter supply, and after 2 weak harvests, her father-in-law and husband had turned to a larger grower. By the time Agnes assumed full control of the accounts, the new supplier had long occupied its place in the books. Merecombe belonged to a part of the business she had never been required to manage. Clara looked towards the old crate. 1 box was left behind. The last one, perhaps. It might have arrived expecting to be filled and returned to Bath. Instead, it had remained in the storehouse after the final small harvest. Once the purchasing arrangement ended, no one at Bell and Son had thought to ask after a single missing crate. At Merecombe, it had been used first for storage and later turned upside down beneath the uneven rack. Agnes ran her finger beneath one of the old entries. The words Merecombe keeper stirred a memory she had not connected with the orchard before. During the early years of her marriage, Bell and Son had become known for having sound apples after the softer autumn fruit had begun to spoil. Customers came in December, asking for the small keeping apples that could remain in a cool pantry for weeks. Some bought them by the box, others returned for a few at a time, saying that the rough-looking fruit lasted better than the brighter varieties sold earlier in the season. Her father-in-law had considered the winter trade important, a shop that could provide reliable fruit when other sellers had little worth carrying earned customers who returned in spring and summer as well. Agnes had understood that lesson and preserved it throughout her own years at Bell and Son. Until that morning, she had not known which apples helped teach it. She looked again at the figures. Merecombe had not supplied all the shop's fruit, nor had the arrangement lasted for many years. Other growers, carriers and workers had contributed to Bell and Son before Agnes inherited its responsibilities. The shop's later stability had required long hours of her own, careful purchasing, strict accounts, difficult economies, and countless decisions made when neither Thomas nor the customers saw her working. Nothing in the delivery book diminished those years. It simply placed something beneath them. The winter trade she had spent a lifetime protecting had begun, in part, with crates of small, rough apples from the very rows she had recently considered removing. Agnes closed the book halfway, leaving one finger between the pages. In the storehouse, she had passed trays of Merecombe keepers without finding them attractive. Their skins were dull, some were uneven in shape, and several bore russeted marks that would have prevented her from placing them at the center of the Bell and Son window. She had regarded them chiefly as fruit from aging trees, less regular and less immediately saleable than the clean, bright varieties preferred by many customers. But they had never depended upon beauty for their value. They had traveled well. They had remained sound. They had filled the shop during the cold months when other apples softened and failed. Customers had remembered Bell and Son because the fruit was still useful after prettier stock had disappeared. Clara waited quietly beside the desk. Agnes reopened the book and read the entries once more, this time following the movement of the empty crates as carefully as the movement of the fruit. Bell and Son boxes had travelled from Bath to Merecombe. Here they had been filled from the keeper rows, carried to the station, and returned to the shop. One empty crate had completed only half that journey and remained behind long enough for its purpose to be forgotten. The painted name had survived beneath the dust. Agnes copied the relevant years and delivery quantities onto a separate sheet. She did not speak of Mr. Merton's proposal, nor did she alter any part of the sale inventory. When she finished, she asked Clara to place the old delivery books with Eleanor's ledger so that both sets of records could be examined again. "And the crate?" Clara asked. "Bring it into the office." They set it beneath the window, where the faded mark faced the desk. Its loosened slat remained loose, and Agnes made no attempt to clean the wood beyond what was necessary to read the lettering. Outside, the late apples still hung among thinning leaves. The old keeper rows looked no straighter than they had the day before. Their fruit remained small and scarred, and two of the trees were still dead. Yet the name upon the crate had restored something the polished shop front in Bath had never displayed. Long before Agnes carried Bell and Son alone, before she balanced its most difficult accounts or protected its reputation through lean seasons, rough apples from Merecombe had waited in its winter storeroom. They had not been beautiful. They had been useful, and people had remembered the shop that sold them. The following morning, Agnes returned to Eleanor's office before breakfast. A small fire burned in the grate, though the room was still cool. Mist rested between the nearest trees, softening the orchard beyond the windows. Beneath one of them stood the old Bell and Son crate. Its faded lettering turned towards the desk. Clara had wiped away the loose dust, but the split slat and worn corners remained untouched. The delivery books lay beside Eleanor's ledger. They explained how the crate had reached Merecombe and why Agnes had forgotten the orchard's connection with the shop. The arrangement had belonged to the years when her father-in-law and husband still managed the principal purchases. By the time the accounts passed fully into her hands, Bell and Son had already found another supplier. Yet the discovery had left Agnes with a question the delivery records could not answer. Why had Eleanor chosen her? Jonah had spent most of his life among the trees. He understood the soil, the weather, and the habits of every important variety. Clara knew the daily work of Merecombe and had learned to keep its accounts. Agnes belonged to Bath. Her knowledge lay in trade, property, and figures entered neatly into ledgers. Eleanor must have known that she would examine the orchard as an asset, and that Mr. Merton's offer might appear more practical than the uncertain labor of retaining it. If Eleanor had wished only to preserve Merecombe, Agnes seemed an unusual choice. She sat at the desk and opened the estate file. The first pages contained the familiar description of the property: the farmhouse, orchard, cider house, storehouse, gardener's cottage, and surrounding acreage. A copy of the will followed, together with the solicitor's memorandum concerning the transfer. Agnes had read the principal clauses before coming to Merecombe. There was no trust preventing a sale, no requirement that the orchard remain undivided, and no instruction that the old keeper rose must be preserved. Eleanor had asked Agnes to stay long enough to see the eastern rose opened, but she had placed no legal obligation upon what must happen afterwards. Near the back of the file, Agnes found a folded sheet inside a cover marked "Correspondence Concerning Testamentary Instructions." It was a copy of a letter Eleanor had written to the solicitor several years earlier. The writing was steady, with a few corrections added in the margins. It had not been composed as a final message to Agnes. It was a practical explanation of the choices Eleanor wished the solicitor to place into legal form. Agnes began to read. Eleanor first described Merecombe as a working property rather than a memorial to the past. Trees had been replaced throughout its history. Buildings had changed their uses. Markets had risen and declined, and each generation had altered the orchard according to what the land could support. Eleanor did not believe that everything old must remain merely because it was familiar. She then explained why Merecombe had not been left to Jonah. His knowledge was essential to the orchard, but he had never wished to own it. Land ownership would require him to manage contracts, capital, taxes, and decisions far removed from the work he valued. Eleanor considered it unfair to turn his devotion to the trees into a burden he had not chosen. Agnes paused over that paragraph. When she first arrived, it had seemed natural that the person who understood Merecombe best should possess it. She now saw that Jonah's knowledge and ownership were not the same thing. Giving him the property would not simply have rewarded his work. It would have changed that work entirely. The next paragraph concerned Clara. At the time the will was prepared, Clara had only recently begun learning the accounts. Eleanor trusted her patience and believed she might one day become capable of managing the orchard, but affection was not preparation. Clara did not yet have enough experience to judge difficult contracts, uncertain markets, or an offer intended to appear simpler than it truly was. There was no criticism in Eleanor's words. She had not doubted Clara's character. She had believed only that Clara should be allowed time to learn without having the whole future of Merecombe placed upon her too soon. Then Eleanor came to Agnes. She wrote of Agnes's years at Bell and Son, her understanding of markets, stock, suppliers, and changing prices. Agnes knew that an immediate payment could sometimes be wiser than a long, uncertain return. She also knew that property and goods could be undervalued when judged only by what they produced in a single season. Most importantly, Eleanor wrote, Agnes understood consequences. A figure in a ledger never remained only a figure. It determined what could be bought, which repairs could be made, how long a worker might be retained, and whether a business survived a poor year. Agnes had spent enough of her life making such decisions to know that practicality did not always mean choosing the easiest course. Agnes looked towards the crate beneath the window. At Merecombe, those habits had often seemed to place her at a distance from everyone else. She had asked what the Eastern Rose produced, what the open gate cost, and whether each custom could be justified. She had distrusted anything that could not be clearly entered into the accounts. Eleanor had expected those questions. She had not chosen Agnes despite them. The letter continued by acknowledging that Agnes's connection with Merecombe had become distant. Bath had long been the centre of her life, and Eleanor did not suppose that a few childhood memories would enable her to understand the orchard. She mentioned that Merecombe had once supplied Bell and Son, although the arrangement had ended before Agnes took full responsibility for the shop's purchasing records. Eleanor had known about the deliveries. She had also known that Agnes might not remember them. Nothing in the letter instructed the solicitor to show her the old books or tell her about the surviving crate. Eleanor had left the evidence at Merecombe among the records of the orchard itself. If Agnes remained long enough to examine the place carefully, she might discover it. If she chose not to look, the past would not be used as a claim against her. Near the bottom of the page, Eleanor had written one sentence in a paragraph of its own. Agnes has always known what an apple is worth. I hope she will remain long enough to learn what else it may become. Agnes read the sentence twice. The fire settled quietly behind the grate. Outside, the mist thinned between the trunks, revealing damp grass and the dark branches of the old keeper rose. Eleanor had not dismissed the knowledge Agnes possessed. She had known that Agnes could distinguish between fruit that would sell quickly and fruit that could be stored, between a necessary expense and a careless one, between a temporary loss and the first sign of lasting decline. Those judgments had helped keep Bell and Son secure, but an apple did not cease to have value when it left the shop counter without a price beside it. At Merecombe, Agnes had seen fruit become winter food, cider, an exchange of labor, or the continuation of an old variety. The price remained real, but it was not always the end of the calculation. That was what Eleanor had wanted her to understand. The letter did not ask Agnes to preserve every tree. It did not require her to remain at Merecombe or reject Mr. Merton's offer. Eleanor had asked only that she stay long enough to see what the orchard contained before deciding what could safely be surrendered. Agnes had once believed that Eleanor's absence stood silently against the sale. To keep Merecombe would honor her. To sell it would place practical necessity above the wishes of the dead. The letter removed that division. Eleanor had not left Agnes a command. She had left her the responsibility of making an informed choice. Mr. Merton's offer remained in the desk. Its sum had not become smaller because Agnes now understood the orchard more fully. The buildings would still require repair. Some trees were unproductive, and 2 in the keeper rows were entirely dead. Merecombe could not be protected by refusing every change. Nor had its difficulties disappeared because an old crate connected it with Bell and Son. Agnes was still free to sell. The knowledge brought no immediate relief. A command might have been easier. If Eleanor had written that Merecombe must remain untouched, Agnes could have obeyed or refused. Instead, Eleanor had trusted her to examine the whole property and accept responsibility for whatever followed. Agnes folded the letter along its original crease. She placed it inside its cover and returned it to the estate file. For a moment, her hand remained upon the closed pages. Then she aligned the file with the delivery books and Eleanor's ledger, leaving all 3 together upon the desk. She did not take out Mr. Merton's proposal. She did not call Clara or ask for Jonah. No decision had been made. The morning light reached farther into the room and fell across the faded name on the old crate. Its mark no longer seemed like a debt that Bell and Son owed to Merecombe. The fruit had been purchased, carried to Bath and sold. Both businesses had received what had been agreed between them. What remained was not an unpaid account. It was evidence Agnes had not possessed before. Eleanor had chosen her because she would ask what the orchard was worth. She had asked only that Agnes remain long enough to understand the answer. For several days at the end of October, Jonah watched the sky more often than usual. He studied the low clouds moving above the western fields and the direction in which the smoke bent from the cider house chimney. Each morning, he stood at the edge of the upper orchard for a few minutes before beginning his work, listening to the wind among the tallest branches. It had not yet grown strong, but it arrived in uneven movements, passing through the trees and then falling away until the leaves became still again. The barometer in the farmhouse hall had begun to drop. Jonah said little about it. He carried the long ladders into the storehouse, secured the shorter ones beneath the lean-to, and moved the remaining picking baskets away from the open sides of the sorting shed. Several empty crates were brought indoors. Loose boards near the press house were fastened, and the door Clara had arranged to have repaired was tested twice before nightfall. There were still apples upon the later trees. Most of the main crop had already been gathered, but several rows held fruit that Jonah preferred to leave until the final days of October. He examined them carefully and decided that part of the crop should be picked early. Agnes joined Clara and 2 seasonal workers beneath the trees. The fruit was colder than it had been only a week before, and the grass remained wet until nearly noon. They filled the basket steadily, taking the soundest apples first and leaving those that still required time. Agnes understood the loss involved in picking too soon. Some fruit would not develop its fullest flavor in storage, and several crates might bring less than they would have earned if the weather had remained calm. Yet she did not question Jonah's decision. The direction of the wind, the firmness of a stem, and the movement of a branch were entries in a kind of account she was only beginning to read. By the afternoon, the most exposed trees had been cleared. Fruit remained in the sheltered rows and among the old Merecombe keepers, whose branches twisted close enough to one another to break the force of the wind. Jonah believed many of those apples would hold. Before darkness, he walked once more around the orchard. Agnes saw him from the office window as he checked the gates, secured the tool shed, and lifted a broken length of fencing away from the path. The clouds had thickened until the distant fields disappeared beneath them. Leaves traveled across the grass in small circles and collected against the stone walls. That evening, the wind began soon after supper. At first it moved around the farmhouse in long, low currents, pressing faintly against the windows and drawing a soft sound from the chimney. Clara placed another piece of coal upon the fire. Agnes remained at the dining room table with the estate papers open before her, although she found herself reading the same line more than once. By 9 o'clock, the sound had deepened. The trees nearest the house bent and released themselves, their upper branches brushing together in the darkness. Rain followed, striking the windows in brief showers before being carried away. Somewhere beyond the kitchen garden, a loose latch moved repeatedly against wood until Clara went to secure it. There was no violence in the house. The lamps remained steady, the doors held, and the repaired cider-house roof did not lift. Yet the orchard had become a single moving presence beyond the walls. Agnes could hear the wind passing through one row and then another, rising from the lower field before reaching the older trees near the eastern boundary. Jonah had returned to his cottage before the rain began. There was nothing more to be done safely in the darkness. The ladders were under cover, the baskets had been brought inside, and as much fruit as time allowed had been gathered. The remainder belonged for the night to the trees and the weather. Agnes closed the estate file. Mr. Merton's offer lay inside the desk. Eleanor's letter rested with the other papers, while the old Bell and Son crate stood beneath the window. None of those things required attention before morning. She went upstairs shortly after 10. The wind continued for several hours. At times it softened until only rain could be heard against the glass. Then another current came across the fields, entered the orchard, and shook water from the branches. Agnes lay awake through part of it, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar knowledge that she could not estimate what was happening outside. At Bell and Son, loss could usually be counted as soon as it occurred. A spoiled consignment could be opened, inspected, and entered into the accounts. A broken pane revealed its cost at once. Even a decline in trade appeared gradually in the daybooks. The wind offered no figures. It moved unseen through the trees, and every sound suggested a quantity Agnes could not yet measure. Sometime after midnight, the rain lessened. The spaces between the stronger gusts became longer. By the early hours, the house had grown quiet enough for Agnes to sleep. When she came downstairs the following morning, Jonah was already outside. The sky had cleared to a pale grey, but the grass shone with water. Twigs and leaves covered the paths. One small branch had fallen across the kitchen garden wall, and a length of guttering had come loose from the rear of the storehouse. There were no broken windows, no damaged roof, and no tree lying across the orchard road. Then Agnes passed through the lower gate. Hundreds of apples lay upon the wet grass. They rested beneath nearly every tree, some whole and bright among the leaves, others split where they had struck a branch or stone. In the more exposed rows, the ground seemed covered with them. The fruit that had remained safely beyond reach the previous evening was now scattered beneath the trees in no order at all. Clara stopped beside Agnes. Jonah was farther along the row, lifting branches and examining the trunks. None of the principal trees had fallen. One young tree leaned and would need to be supported, while several older branches had torn under the strain. The damage to the trees was limited, but the quantity of fruit upon the ground appeared far greater than Agnes had expected. Her first thought was that most of it had been lost. Fallen apples could not be packed for the regular market. Even when their skins remained unbroken, bruising developed quickly beneath the surface. Buyers who expected sound storage fruit would refuse them, and any apples placed among the undamaged crop might cause spoilage to spread. Agnes looked along the wet rows and began counting what she could see beneath the nearest trees. The figures formed automatically. She considered the number of crates that might have been filled, the price expected from the later crop, and the reduced quantity now available for winter sale. Jonah returned carrying a broken branch. "The trees have held better than the fruit," he said. Agnes looked towards the storehouse. "How much can be saved?" "As apples for market, not a great deal. But we should sort them before the bruises settle." They brought out the baskets and empty crates secured the day before. Clara spread coarse cloths beneath the shelter of the sorting shed, while Jonah collected the first fallen apples from the old keeper rows. Agnes began with the fruit nearest the house, lifting each apple from the wet grass and placing it carefully into her basket. They had been working less than half an hour when the first villager arrived through the eastern gate. He brought a handcart and 3 empty crates. He offered no long explanation. After leaving the cart beside the shed, he joined Jonah beneath the trees and began gathering fruit. A woman came soon afterwards with 2 baskets over her arm and several folded cloths. Behind her walked a younger man carrying a small knife suitable for cutting away damaged portions. Another cart appeared along the lower path. By the time the church clock marked 8, people were entering Merecombe from both the village road and the eastern boundary. No message had been sent. Clara had not asked for help, and Jonah had not left the orchard that morning. The villagers had heard the wind during the night and knew what they would find beneath the trees. Some had received apples through the eastern gate. Others had taken home firewood after pruning, or collected cider when there was more than Merecombe could sell. Several had worked in the orchard during earlier harvests, and some came because their parents had done the same after autumn winds many years before. They arrived with whatever the work required: baskets, carts, clean cloths, knives, and strong empty boxes. There was little need for instruction. The sound fruit was carried to the storehouse, where it would be examined again before being placed with the winter stock. Apples with light bruising went directly towards the press house, so they could be used before the damage deepened. Those with cracked skins were set apart for the farmhouse and the village kitchens. Fruit already spoiled was taken to the compost heap. Not everything was gathered. A small quantity still hanging in the highest branches was left for later, and Jonah asked that some of the fallen fruit at the far edge of the old rows remain for the birds. Agnes worked beside the others. Mud darkened the hem of her skirt, and the damp passed gradually through the knees of her stockings whenever she bent beneath the lower branches. She carried full baskets to the sorting shed, emptied them, and returned without stopping to consider who had come or what each hour of labor might cost if entered as wages. The answer had already been entered elsewhere. It was present in Eleanor's ledger beneath the heading, "Returned to Merecombe." Yet the neat lines had not conveyed the quiet speed with which the village appeared after the wind. They had not shown the handcarts moving through the eastern gate, the cloth spread across the sorting tables, or the baskets passing from one person to another beneath the wet trees. Near midday, Agnes found an apple whose skin was unbroken, but already darkening along one side. A week earlier, she might have placed it with the waste until someone corrected her. Instead, she pressed the flesh gently with her thumb, checked that the bruise had not split, and carried it to the basket intended for the cider press. Clara saw her, but said nothing. By afternoon, the grass beneath the principal rows had been cleared. The fruit no longer appeared as a single ruined crop. It had been divided according to what it could still become. Crates of sound apples stood inside the storehouse. Bruised fruit filled the press house baskets and would be crushed before evening. Several smaller boxes had been set aside for cooking, while the spoiled remains formed a modest heap beside the compost wall. The losses were real, but they were smaller than Agnes's first view of the orchard had suggested. The villagers began leaving as quietly as they had arrived. Empty carts now carried fruit towards the press house or kitchens. Mud clung to boots and wheels. A few people stopped to straighten cloths or return tools before passing through the gate. No one asked Agnes what she intended to do with Merecombe. No one mentioned Mr. Merton's offer. They had not come to influence the future owner. They had come because the wind had passed through the orchard and help was needed before the fallen fruit spoiled. By dusk, only Agnes, Clara, and Jonah remained near the sorting shed. The last usable apples had been carried under cover. Jonah went to check the supported young tree once more, while Clara closed the storehouse and covered the cider baskets. Agnes returned to the farmhouse with mud upon her skirt, apple skin beneath her fingernails, and an ache running through both hands. The evening meal had already been placed upon the kitchen table. She washed only enough to remove the soil from her fingers and sat down without going upstairs to change. For weeks, she had studied the records of what Merecombe gave and what later returned to it. She had corrected the figures, identified hidden labor, and insisted that every exchange be included in the orchard's true accounts. That day, no ledger had been required. The wind had tested Eleanor's system. The village had answered it in work. During the 3 days following the wind, Merecombe returned gradually to its ordinary autumn rhythm. The sound apples were placed in the coolest part of the storehouse. Those intended for cider disappeared beneath the press before their bruises could deepen, and the cracked fruit was carried into kitchens throughout the village. Jonah cut the torn branches cleanly and strengthened the supports around the young tree that had leaned during the night. By the end of the third afternoon, little remained upon the grass, except damp leaves and the apples deliberately left for birds. Clara spent most of those days in Eleanor's office. Agnes had asked her to prepare 2 calculations. The first was to show precisely what Mr. Merton's offer represented when compared with the likely returns of keeping Merecombe. The second was to consider whether the orchard could meet its own costs if every part of the harvest and every form in which its value returned were included. On the 4th morning, Clara placed both sets of papers upon the desk. The first calculation was the simpler of the 2. Mr. Merton's offer provided a large and certain sum. There would be no waiting for another harvest, no expense for replacing trees, and no risk from frost, wind, or changing prices. Once the legal costs had been deducted, the remainder could be invested. The income would be smaller than the best years of the orchard, but steadier than its worst ones. Agnes could return to Bath without responsibility for roofs, fences, wages, or land she had never expected to inherit. Nothing Agnes had discovered at Merecombe made that certainty less real. She read every figure before turning to the second calculation. This one covered several pages. Clara had separated the orchard's produce according to what could be done with it, rather than placing all apples beneath a single expected market price. The cleanest fruit would continue to be sold at market. Its appearance made it suitable for the front of a stall, and it brought the best immediate price. The smaller sound apples, which dealers often purchased reluctantly, could be supplied directly to the village bakery. Their size mattered little once they were peeled and baked, and the baker had already agreed upon a modest but dependable quantity. The Merricombe keepers were entered separately. Their rough skins and uneven shapes made them less attractive during the main autumn trade. But the old delivery books had shown what happened after brighter varieties began to soften. If stored carefully, the keepers could be sold through the winter, when sound apples were scarcer and their appearance mattered less than their endurance. Some could also be added to the cider mixture, where their firmness and sharper flavor gave the pressed fruit a use beyond the market table. The apples shaken down by wind had received their own entries. Those still sound enough to eat could not be stored, but they could be pressed on the day they fell. Cracked fruit could be used in the farmhouse or sent to the bakery when collected quickly. Only fruit already rotting would be taken to the compost heap, where it would return to the soil rather than disappear from the orchard's account as an unexplained loss. Agnes examined the estimates carefully. Several depended upon work being done at the proper time. A bruised apple carried to the press that afternoon still had value. The same apple left upon the grass until the next morning might have none. The plan required judgment, labor, and people who knew where each part of the crop belonged. It offered no easy profit. It did, however, show that a greater portion of the harvest could be used than the earlier estate summary had suggested. At the end of Clara's calculation appeared the exchanges recorded in Eleanor's book. The fruit, cider, and firewood, leaving through the eastern gate, had been entered at an estimated value. Beside them, Clara had placed the labor, cartage, and repairs returned to Merecombe. She had not matched one person's basket of apples against 1 hour of work. Eleanor's arrangement had never operated in that manner. Instead, Clara had calculated the total value of what the orchard issued during several seasons and compared it with the work that had reduced Merecombe's expenses over the same period. The figures were necessarily cautious. Some acts could be valued with reasonable accuracy: a journey to the station, a repaired door, or a day spent gathering fallen fruit. Others could not be translated neatly into money. Clara had therefore used the lowest defensible estimate whenever the record was uncertain. Even then, the eastern gate did not represent the simple loss Agnes had first assumed. The fruit given there created no direct revenue, but the system surrounding it reduced the orchard's costs. It could not replace wages, and Agnes would not permit it to do so. Jonah, Clara, and the seasonal workers still required proper payment. Yet the exchanges mattered, particularly during storms, repairs, and the brief parts of the year when work had to be completed before the weather changed. Agnes added the columns again herself. When the ordinary expenses, necessary repairs, and wages were deducted, Merecombe produced a small surplus. It was not large enough to justify careless spending. One poor harvest could reduce it, and 2 poor seasons might remove it entirely. Nor could the orchard support the immediate restoration of every building and boundary. Work would have to be ordered according to need, but Merecombe could support itself. The property was not yielding the return Mr. Merton's offer might provide if invested elsewhere. It was not a highly profitable estate, and the new calculation did not pretend that it would become one. It was simply not dying. Agnes left the 2 sets of figures beside one another for the remainder of the morning. She went first to the eastern rows, where Jonah was examining the old keeper trees. The 2 dead trees stood among the living ones, with bare branches exposed against the pale sky. Nothing would be gained by leaving them in the ground. Their removal had already been included in the repair estimate. Jonah rested one hand upon the 3rd tree in the lower row. Its trunk leaned slightly, but its branches had endured the wind better than those of several younger trees. "There is sound wood here," he said, and on 2 of the trees above it. Agnes looked at the branches he indicated. "Enough for grafting? If it is taken at the proper time, the young trees would not produce a full crop for years. Some grafts might fail, and others might never possess precisely the habits of the trees from which they came. Yet waiting until the remaining keepers died would leave nothing from which to begin. The 2 dead trees should come down," Agnes said. "Take the grafting wood before any of the other old trees are replaced." Jonah nodded. There was no need for a longer answer. They walked to the small eastern gate. It was closed now that the 2 afternoons had passed. Beyond it, the path crossed the field towards the village, still marked faintly by wheels and boots from the morning after the wind. "The 7 rows will remain for the open days," Agnes said. Jonah looked at her, but did not thank her. Agnes was glad of it. She was not granting the village a favor because the sight of people beneath the trees had softened her. The eastern rows belonged within a working system whose value could now be seen in both Eleanor's records and Clara's calculations. When Agnes returned to the office, she asked Clara to sit opposite her. The younger woman arrived carrying the orchard ledger, but Agnes motioned for her to leave it closed. What had to be settled was not another entry. Agnes explained that she would not sell Merecombe during the coming year. The orchard would be allowed to pass through winter, blossom, summer growth, and one further harvest before its position was reconsidered. At the end of that year, the accounts would show whether the small surplus could be maintained and whether the new uses found for the crop were dependable. Clara listened quietly. "I shall need someone here with authority to make ordinary decisions," Agnes continued. "Not someone who must write to Bath because a carrier changes his day or the bakery requires another crate." Clara's hands remained upon the closed ledger. Agnes told her that a 1-year management agreement would be prepared. Clara would supervise the records, sales, transport, and ordinary household business of Merecombe. She could arrange the use of fruit, employ seasonal help within the agreed budget, and approve minor repairs without waiting for Agnes. Jonah would remain responsible for the orchard itself. He would direct pruning, grafting, cultivation, and harvest work, and he would continue teaching Clara what could not be learned from the accounts. His knowledge would be treated as part of the management of Merecombe, not as an informal service expected because he had given it for many years. Changes affecting the land as a whole would still require Agnes's approval. No field was to be sold or leased, no large section cleared, and no substantial debt taken on without her consent. For everything else, Clara would be permitted to manage the property she had already helped to keep running. "You will send me a report at the end of each quarter," Agnes said. Clara glanced towards the papers. "With all the weekly figures copied into it?" "No. A summary of sales, expenses, repairs, and the condition of the crop will be sufficient. If something unusual occurs, you may write before then. And the Eastern Gate? Issued fruit will continue to be recorded. So will work returned to Merecombe. No names are to be added unless they are required for an ordinary business entry." Clara understood. The ledger would preserve the value of the exchange without becoming a record of private need. Agnes placed one hand upon the two calculations. "This is an agreement for a year," she said. "It is not a promise that Merecombe will never be sold. I know. If the orchard cannot support its work, we shall have to consider that honestly. Yes." Clara did not ask for more. A year contained enough time to establish the winter trade in the keeper apples, prepare the grafts, renew the bakery arrangement, and test whether the new accounts described the orchard accurately. It was not forever, but it was more than a delay made out of sentiment. Agnes told her that she intended to return in spring. "To inspect the accounts?" Clara asked. "To see the blossom." The words sounded unfamiliar in Agnes's own voice, yet she did not correct them. The quarterly report could be read in Bath. Blossom could not. That afternoon, Agnes prepared her reply to Mr. Merton. She thanked him for his patience and stated that, after completing a fuller examination of the property, she had decided not to accept his offer. Merecombe would remain under her ownership for at least another year. She did not describe the Eastern Gate, the old Bell & Son crate, or the people who had crossed the wet orchard carrying baskets after the wind. Mr. Merton did not need to understand those things. His offer had been reasonable, and Agnes's refusal required no accusation against it. After signing the letter, she placed it beside the management instructions Clara would take to the solicitor. The decision did not make Merecombe permanent. 2 dead trees would soon be cut down. Other trees would follow when they no longer produced sound fruit. The uses of the buildings might change, and the plan itself would be altered if the next harvest proved its estimates wrong. Agnes had not promised to preserve the orchard exactly as Eleanor had left it. She had only refused to destroy a working system before watching it pass through all 4 seasons. Through the office window, she could see Clara crossing the courtyard with Jonah. He carried the pruning notes, while she held the pages containing the winter sales estimates. They stopped near the storehouse, where Clara pointed towards the shelves intended for the Merecombe keepers. Jonah answered, and together they went inside. Neither looked towards the office for permission. Agnes folded Mr. Merton's proposal and returned it to its envelope. The large, certain sum remained written upon the page. The smaller, less certain surplus remained upon Clara's calculations. For the first time, Agnes felt no need to make one of them appear less truthful in order to choose the other. Merecombe had not waited for her to rescue it. The orchard had continued through the knowledge of Jonah, the work of Clara, and the exchanges kept alive beyond the eastern gate. It needed only enough time to show what it already knew how to do. Agnes gave it 1 year. Agnes returned to Bath during the first week of November. The train carried her east beneath a low sky, through fields already emptied of their harvest, and villages darkened by early rain. Hedgerows passed the window in bare, wet lines. In the hollows, pale mist rested above the grass, and the last leaves clung to the trees with a color that appeared deeper whenever the afternoon light reached them. Her luggage occupied no more space than it had on the journey to Merecombe. The same dresses had been folded into the same cases. The estate papers travelled in the leather document bag at her feet, together with Clara's calculations, the signed management agreement, and a copy of the letter declining Mr. Merton's offer. Yet there was one object among her belongings that had not left Bath with her. Wrapped in a square of plain cloth was a single Merecombe keeper. Agnes had chosen it from the winter store on the morning of her departure. It was small enough to rest comfortably in her palm and slightly narrower on one side than the other. A brown scar crossed its rough green skin, beginning near the stem and curving towards the lower half of the fruit. Jonah had examined it before allowing her to take it. The mark had formed early in the season, he explained, perhaps where a twig had rubbed against the young apple during spring winds. The skin had closed around the injury. Nothing beneath it was spoiled. The apple would keep. Agnes had placed it in her case without explaining why she wanted it. Rain had begun by the time the train entered Bath. Water shone upon the station roof, and the lamps had already been lit beneath the glass canopy. Porters moved through the steam in dark coats, calling quietly to one another as luggage was unloaded. Beyond the station entrance, carriage wheels passed over wet stone, and the familiar buildings rose in pale terraces against the November evening. For several weeks, Agnes had awakened to the sound of orchard ladders, carts upon the lower road, and wind moving through the trees. Now she heard bells, wheels, footsteps, and the closing of shop doors. Nothing in Bath appeared to have waited for her. This did not trouble her as much as it once might have done. The following morning, Agnes entered Bell & Son shortly after the doors were opened. The brass handle was cold beneath her glove. As she stepped inside, the familiar scents of apples, dried herbs, polished wood, and brown paper returned with such completeness that Merecombe seemed, for one moment, farther away than the distance of a railway journey. Then she looked towards the front window. It had changed. The difference was not dramatic. The shop remained orderly, and nothing had been placed carelessly. The glass was clean, the trays were polished, and every item carried a clearly written price. Yet the arrangement possessed more space than it had when Agnes left. The fruit was no longer pressed into tightly measured rows. Apples rested in shallow wooden trays according to their use, with enough room between them for a customer to lift one without disturbing the remainder. Pears occupied a smaller display near the center. Several late plums had been placed in a simple bowl rather than arranged in the formal pattern Agnes had always required. A small board stood behind the apples. Upon it, in Thomas's careful hand, were 4 headings: for eating fresh, for baking, for sauces, for winter keeping. Beneath each heading appeared the names of suitable varieties and a short description of their qualities. Crispness was listed where crispness mattered. Tartness was recommended for pies. Softer fruit was offered for sauces, while the firmest apples were marked for storage. In one tray lay fruit that would once have been removed from the front of the shop before Agnes arrived in the morning. The apples were sound, but their shapes were uneven. One carried russeting around the stem. Another had grown so close to a branch that a shallow mark remained along its side. A third was smaller than the ordinary grade expected for display. None was concealed beneath better-looking fruit. A card explained that they were suitable for cooking and priced accordingly. 2 customers stood near the counter while Thomas helped an older woman choose apples for a pudding. He did not immediately see Agnes enter. She remained beside the doorway and watched him lift 2 varieties from their trays, describe the difference between them, and place the smaller, sharper apples into a paper bag. The woman left with what she needed rather than what appeared most impressive in the window. Only then did Thomas look up. For an instant, his expression was that of the boy who had once waited for his mother to inspect a shelf he had arranged. The look passed quickly, but Agnes recognized it. "Mother." "Good morning, Thomas." He came from behind the counter. Agnes removed her gloves slowly, still looking towards the window. "You have altered the display," she said. "Yes." Thomas offered no immediate defense of it. The accounts would show whether the changes had affected sales, and both of them knew that Agnes would read those figures in due course. She walked towards the trays. The arrangement was less exact than the one she had maintained for years, but it was not without order. Its order simply depended upon purpose rather than symmetry. Customers could see that one imperfect apple might be more useful than another polished one, provided they understood what they intended to make from it. Near the front stood a small handwritten label that had been placed at a slight angle. Agnes noticed it at once. Her hand rose almost before she had decided to move it. 2 fingers extended towards the edge of the card, prepared to straighten it against the line of the tray. Then she stopped. The writing was clear. The price was correct. No customer could misunderstand it. Agnes lowered her hand. Thomas had seen the movement, but he said nothing. She continued through the shop, examining the remaining shelves. The changes had not made Bell and Son careless. Goods nearing the end of their usefulness were grouped where they could be sold promptly. Produce intended to keep was stored away from warmer parts of the room. Nothing spoiled had been left among sound fruit, and nothing had been presented as better than it was. The difference was smaller than Agnes had expected, and more important than it first appeared. Bell and Son still valued appearance. It simply no longer treated appearance as the whole of value. By late morning, Agnes had resumed her place at the desk behind the shop. Several weeks of records awaited her, but they had been kept neatly. Thomas had marked unusual expenses, enclosed the carrier's receipts, and entered the new fruit categories without altering the established form of the daybook. Agnes worked through the first pages without interruption. She did not correct the window card. Thomas waited until the shop was quiet before asking about Merecombe. He stood in the doorway of the office, one hand resting against the frame. Beyond him, an assistant wrapped a parcel at the counter. Rain tapped lightly against the front glass. "Was the orchard sold?" he asked. "No." Thomas remained where he was. Agnes closed the ledger before answering further. "I have decided to retain it for another year. Clara will manage the property, and Jonah will remain responsible for the trees. I shall receive reports each quarter. For 1 year, at least one." She did not tell him about the eastern gate or Eleanor's ledger. She did not describe the Bell and Son crate discovered beneath the storehouse shelf, nor explain that the first winter apples associated with the shop's early reputation had traveled from Merecombe in boxes bearing the family name. She did not recount the night of wind or the villagers arriving the next morning with carts, knives, and folded cloths. Those facts would not be lost because she did not speak of them immediately. Thomas looked towards the closed ledger, and after the year, "I shall decide when I have seen what the year contains." It was not the answer Agnes would once have given. She had spent most of her life reducing uncertainty whenever it entered her accounts. Yet an orchard could not be understood from one harvest, and she no longer considered that admission a failure of judgment. Thomas nodded. He did not ask why she had changed her mind. Perhaps he understood that the explanation could not be given in a single sentence. Perhaps he recognized that Agnes herself had not yet placed every part of it into words. Whatever his reason, he returned to the shop without pressing her further. Agnes reopened the ledger. The business had remained sound during her absence. Customers had not abandoned Bell and Son because several apples bore marks upon their skins. The wider spacing in the window had not made the shop appear empty, and the signs explaining the uses of different fruit had encouraged purchases that might otherwise have been lost. There were details Agnes would refine. Some prices required review, and one entry concerning a delivery had been placed in the wrong column. She marked it lightly in pencil. She did not restore the old arrangement. That evening, the rain became steadier. It fell across the roofs of Bath and gathered along the edges of the windows before running down the glass. Carriages passed less frequently as the streets darkened. One by one, the neighboring shops extinguished their lamps and secured their doors. Agnes remained at Bell and Son until the usual closing hour, but she did not walk through every room before going upstairs. Thomas checked the rear entrance. The assistant drew the curtain across the shop window. The day's money had already been counted and placed where it belonged. When the final lamp below was lowered, Agnes heard the movement from the landing and continued towards her room. Bell and Son closed without requiring her inspection. In her bedroom, a small fire had been lit. Its light moved faintly across the washstand and the polished wardrobe. The room appeared exactly as it had before her departure, yet Agnes noticed its stillness more clearly after the wide, breathing darkness of Merecombe. She placed her gloves upon the dressing table and opened the smaller case. The Merricombe keeper lay inside its square of cloth. Agnes lifted it carefully. The apple had survived the journey without bruising. Its skin remained firm, its shape slightly uneven, and the old brown scar plainly visible beneath the lamplight. It was not the sort of fruit she would once have selected for a prominent place in the shop window. Nor would she have chosen it for a guest when brighter and more regular apples were available. Upon the shelf stood a set of fine china plates. They had been brought out for visitors, formal teas, and occasions when the appearance of the room was expected to express care. When no guest was present, they remained unused behind the cabinet glass. Agnes opened the cabinet and removed the finest plate. It was white porcelain with a narrow painted border, delicate enough that she held it with both hands while carrying it to the dressing table. She set it beneath the lamp and placed the Merecombe keeper at its center. The apple did not become more symmetrical upon the china. Its rough skin did not appear smoother, and the scar was not softened by the fine painted edge surrounding it. The plate displayed the fruit exactly as it was. Agnes stood looking at it for a while. From the document case, she removed the papers Clara had prepared before her departure. The management agreement had already been signed. Beneath it lay a letter, enclosed with the first plan for the spring pruning. Agnes placed the letter beside the plate. She did not open it that night. There would be time in the morning to read which trees Jonah intended to graft, which branches would be removed, and how the work would be entered in the coming year's accounts. Merecombe no longer depended upon Agnes answering every question before the day ended. She extinguished the brighter lamp and left only the smaller one burning beside the bed. Outside, November rain continued over the Bath rooftops. It softened the lines of chimneys and gathered in the dark streets below. Beneath her room, Bell and Son stood locked and quiet, its fruit arranged for another morning by hands other than hers. Clara's letter waited unopened. The orchard waited for winter. The little apple rested upon the china plate. Its scar remained in the light. Nothing asked to be hidden. And now, as the November rain falls softly over Bath and the old orchard settles into winter, you may let the story fade gently from your thoughts. Nothing more needs to be decided tonight. The shop is closed. The apple rests quietly in the lamplight, and all is well. Breathe slowly. Allow the darkness to gather peacefully around you, and drift now into a deep and restful sleep. Good night.